Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring the Cold War Adversaries. War Game by Bryce Walton. The Answer by H. Beam Piper. Wait for Wait by Jack McKenty. Let's Get Together by Asimov. Formula for Murder by Milton A. Rothman.
War Game by Bryce Walton, originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, February 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The Minister of Peace asked the United States President if he had heard from the Secretary of State. "Yes," the President said. "I heard from Mr. Thompson only a few minutes ago." "How's their final conference coming, Mr. President?" "Inevitably. Operation Push Button within the hour." The Minister of Peace blinked out the window at Washington, D.C. "So they're going to blow up the world?" "Inevitably." "Shall we watch it?" asked the Minister of Peace. The President nodded, spoke to Master Control through the intercom box on his desk, and switched on the TV screen. They had a special pipeline into the United Nations cellar. They sat back, had martinis, and watched the interior of the cellar come to life on the screen. 3,000 miles from New Washington, under a natural camouflage of tundra and wintry hills, the UN cellar was thought by its occupants to be thoroughly resistant to any offensive weapons. It was 3 miles underground, protected by lead, concrete, and steel. Its location was known only to the UN Security Division that was supposed to be strictly neutral in international affairs, or so the cellar occupants assumed. The engineers and workmen who had planned and constructed the cellar were supposed to have been brainwashed and therefore had no memory of the great project. An occasional caribou drifted over the cellar with the north wind, and wolves that always follow the caribou. In his suite, Chandler Thompson, Secretary of State, prepared himself for the global diplomacy game's final hand, in which it is never so important what hand you play as the way you play it. After years of negotiation, full agreement on Operation Push Button had been attained, and Thompson took some pride in having played a leading role in the ingenious idea. Morton, his valet, finished shaving Thompson's pale face, helped him dress in striped trousers, cutaway and white gardenia. "Thank you, Morton," said the Secretary of State. "You seem calm enough, sir. Frankly, I'm ill at ease." "You may leave the cellar if you wish," Thompson said, skimming through his notes. "You've served graciously. I appreciate it. But it is your privilege to return to your family outside now. I might remind you that your chance of survival if you remain here is practically 100%. "It isn't that, sir. It just seems incredible that so many must die." He felt of his wallet, the pictures of his family with it. "It's hardly a matter of principle," Thompson said, "nor a question of ideology. It's simply a question of firmness and realistic practicality, and getting the job done once and for all. That had been my stand from the beginning, and naturally it cannot be changed. But billions of people dying. Death before dishonor, Morton." "Yes, sir." Morton knew that in every suite in the cellar, every diplomat was saying practically the same thing. Thompson looked up from his neat notes. "People, Morton, have been properly prepared for violent death. Indeed, there has been a feeling of security in numbers. The Ministry of Education, working with the War Department, has done such a splendid job. Now every child has grown up fully prepared to die in the Holocaust, and every individual, still a child, regards violent death as casually as a game of marbles. The required attitude has been thoroughly conditioned in the populace. The idea was to make violence, savagery, and sudden death an everyday affair. And we have done it. Sad, but a necessary task. Morton said nothing. Thompson looked at the neon map coruscating on the wall. Our country is not unique in this, Morton. Annihilation will come as a shock only to the misinformed anywhere in the world. Morton sat down. He remembered how his kids used to come home from school laughingly playing war games, manipulating toy atomic cannons and the like. They received additional marks in school for being good and cooperative during atomic bomb drills and preparations for thermonuclear disasters. They had been so proud of their dog tags that came with boxes of cereal. In the evenings, out back, they used to have bury the dead games. Thompson was saying, "Remember juvenile delinquency? It was necessary. Millions had to be conditioned psychologically for Operation Killer. An insensitive, fatalistic attitude had to be engendered, for their own good." Morton flicked a speck of lint from Thompson's stooped shoulder. "Yes, sir," he said. "Maybe it will be humane in the long run." "One must face the hard materialistic facts," Thompson said. "Oh, that reminds me." He went to his private switchboard and got a secret outside line to the Office of Civilian Defense. "Hello, Donaldson. Yes, I'm fine. I haven't talked with you for some time now, and I was wondering about that suggestion of mine. Yes, the household pets thing. That's right, particularly dogs. They're big morale factors in the lives of children, and there may be some survivors. Well then, issue another bulletin on that immediately. Things are reaching ahead here in the cellar. Yes, dogs should be lashed firmly to heavy pieces of furniture away from windows. Put water where they can reach it. Hysteria under the bombing attacks can be avoided by giving sodium bromide tablets to the dogs. That's right, survivors will need pets. Morale." After Thompson was through talking to Donaldson, Morton said, "You know, sir, the end will be a relief to some people. They've been blitzed by a non-stop barrage of fear bombs so long, I think they'll be glad to get it over with." "Very perceptive, Morton. That has been one of psychological warfare's primary aims in preparation." Thompson got another outside line. "Dawson, Civilian Defense." As he waited for Dawson to come in, he said to Morton, "Get the dueling pistols out of the cabinet, please." Morton nodded. "Hello, Dawson. Fine, things coming to a head here. How much distribution did you manage on the shrouds? 80%? Excellent. I haven't heard from Harry on the details for quite a while. Wanted to check personally. As you say, I've never really lost my touch with the grassroots. My feeling from the start was that millions of wooden coffins would be out of the question. The olive drab plastic sheets seemed to be the only practical recourse from the start. The psychological importance of getting bodies out of sight as rapidly as possible cannot be overemphasized. Oh, Dawson, one moment. Yes, I know about the public parks, playgrounds, and vacant tracts in the suburbs. But what about New York City? The only way is to send the bodies up the Hudson River using piers as morgues. The problem of where to put so many bodies, particularly when they will all appear for disposal at the same time, is a considerable one. Allowing for 3x6 grave sites with 3 feet for aisles, the whole problem of adequate disposal acreage is primary. Thompson switched off the connection. Thompson moved his fingers over the .38 caliber dueling pistols in the velvet-lined case. His eyes mellowed with nostalgia. Gift from the old Secretary of War. My boy, Don, learned to shoot with this one when he was only 6 years old. If he had lived to be an adult, he would have been a tough fighter. But he was killed by a rival delinquent gang when he was 12. He only got there a little sooner. He had just finished reading Niebuhr, so he knew the tragic irony of history. Thompson balanced one of the pistols in his hand. He looked at his watch. "It's time," he said religiously. As Thompson entered the Hall of Ministers, the representatives of 5 balance of power nations arose at once in deference to the 6th. Morton sat unobtrusively in a far corner, holding the case of dueling pistols on his knees. Thompson sat down. The minutes of the last conference were read by the mechanical secretary. A summation of their final agreement on Operation Push Button was briefly reviewed by the automatic translating secretary. No changes were suggested. The surface of the huge conference table was somewhat like a gigantic topographical map of the world. It covered perhaps 1,000 square feet and had been constructed by brainwashed artisans and engineers and scientists in perfect electronic detail. It was so realistic that it radiated a sort of sentience, seeming almost to breathe in astonishing precision, with the respiration of important strategically located cities, ports, communication and manufacturing centers. Before each minister was a console containing several buttons. Each minister arose, made a speech concerning the sovereign rights of the particular nation or block of nations he represented. In each case, the speeches seemed the same to Morton. He knew that if merely the name of the country or block in each speech was changed, the rest would be the same, and sound something like, "Gentlemen, a free such-and-such people can no longer tolerate a militant rearming so-and-so. Every other possibility has been discussed and rejected. I must say now that this moment a state of war must of necessity exist between such-and-such and so-and-so." Morton had been hearing variations of it for years. He knew it all by heart. As each minister made this implacable statement, he sat down and, without further ceremony, pushed a button or buttons on his private console. On the topographical map, as a button was pushed, some important section of the map, an area, a city, a port, some significant transportation, communication, or manufacturing industrial center would shoot out realistic sparks, smoke, and then crumble into lifeless debris. Morton tried to control the flinching and twitching of his muscles. An intricate network of electronic relays connected with thermonuclear bombs went out all over the world and were hooked into the map on the conference table. Millions of people were just blown up somewhere, Morton thought. Another minister finished his speech, sat down, pressed buttons. More smoke and flashes shot up. Millions of others out there somewhere had just been annihilated, Morton thought. It doesn't seem possible, he thought then. It's not possible. It's some kind of final madness. But it's happening. It had been decided that this was the simple, direct way, avoiding long, time-wasting programs of mobilization and warfare. If the conclusion was foregone, had been the question, then why not go directly to it by the shortest and most efficient route? And the answer was as inevitable as the question. More ministers stood up, made their final declarations, and pushed buttons. Little puffballs and clouds of smoke drifted over the conference table, obscuring distinctive facial outlines and turning the ministers into shadow shapes as Morton watched. Only 2 of the ministers had not yet pressed their buttons. Only 2 sectors of the world remain alive, Morton thought. He coughed as acrid smoke swirled about the room. He felt a kind of blessed numbed paralysis. He could almost feel the whole world turning into a radioactive hell all around him, mushrooms of a gigantic size sprouting fast and furiously in the last big aftermath of rain. Yet he could scarcely imagine how it really was now outside the cellar. He thought vaguely about the dogs, wondering how many of them had avoided hysteria by having been tied to heavy pieces of furniture and given sodium bromide tablets. The kids who survived would need pets. Morton sat there, trying to see through the thickening smoke. He tried to feel grateful for having been in the cellar, but in a few more seconds America might also be destroyed. What then? And what if only America remained? Would that be any better? He had resisted such speculation, but how could he resist it any longer? The ministers had their wives, families, lovers in the cellar, and supplies enough to last indefinitely. But Morton's family was outside. In a few seconds they might be dead. After that, nothing. Nothing at all. He heard Thompson say in a calm voice, "Morton, the pistols." He also heard the other minister say in Russian that he wanted his pistol. Morton had to respect the secret agreement that Thompson and the Russian minister had made yesterday. After the other ministers pushed their buttons, Thompson and the Russian would fight a duel, then the survivor of the duel would push his button. Someone should win, Thompson and the Russian had agreed. This way, one will be the absolute victor. If the other ministers knew what this secret agreement was, they either did not care or did not care enough now. They got up from the conference table and drifted out of the big spheroid room to their families, wives, wherever they wanted to go. Now only Thompson and the Russian remained in the room. They walked 10 paces away from one another in the classic tradition of honourable duelling, turned and fired. They fell almost at the same time. Morton rushed over to Thompson, who was already dead, having died instantly with a bullet in his heart. Morton saw that the Russian had a bullet hole just above his left eye. Thompson, foreseeing this possible situation, had gotten a promise from Morton that he would press the button that would annihilate Russia in case Thompson was dead or incapacitated. That would leave the United States the sole victor in the last great global struggle to establish once and for all, worldwide, the true faith. Morton fought a brief struggle with his conscience, then ran out of the room, leaving the console untouched. The United States and Russia still survived. Morton's family was still safe. He ran toward the bank of elevators to get out of the cellar. He hadn't been out of the cellar for a long, long time. The President of the United States switched off the TV and poured another martini. "You want another?" he asked the Minister of Peace. "No, sir, Mr. President." For a while they said nothing as they looked out the window at the peaceful sunshine and watched birds settle in the trees. "They ran their own course," the Minister of Peace said. "Just the same, it was an unpleasant thing to see." "Inevitable," said the President. "There wasn't any other possible way to handle them." Psychiatry would never have altered their rigid mould, he knew. It was a strangely funny thing, that spontaneous rebellion all over the world, the people putting a stop to the whole damn vicious historical show. But they had done it. The lie had been given to all the historical pessimists like Spencer and Toynbee and Marx and all the others who had said the same things, whether they really had admitted it or not. The people, acting out of intuitive realization that they had faced annihilation, had reacted en masse and taking things over for themselves. Now you couldn't find even a water pistol anywhere in the world. The UN cellar had been walled off, turned into a kind of sanitarium. Its occupants had never known the truth about the outside. Thompson and that absurd Russian were dead. But what about the others in the cellar, living there still and believing they were the only few survivors left in the world? Poor bastards, the President thought. And then he thought of that statement by Sartre, the one about hell being a restaurant where you served yourself.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Answer by H. Beam Piper. Originally published in Fantastic Universe Science Fiction, December 1959. Narrated by Tom Trussel. For a moment, after the screen door snapped and wakened him, Lee Richardson sat breathless and motionless, his eyes still closed, trying desperately to cling to the dream and print it upon his conscious memory before it faded. "Are you there, Lee?" he heard Alexis Pitov's voice. "Yes, I'm here. What time is it?" he asked, and then added, "I fell asleep. I was dreaming." It was all right. He was going to be able to remember. He could still see the slim woman with the greying blonde hair, playing with a little dachshund among the new fallen leaves on the lawn. He was glad they'd both been in this dream together. These dream glimpses were all he'd had for the last 15 years, and they were too precious to lose. He opened his eyes. The Russian was sitting just outside the light from the open door of the bungalow, lighting a cigarette. For a moment he could see the blocky, high-cheeked face, now pouched and wrinkled, and then the flame went out, and there was only the red coal glowing in the darkness. He closed his eyes again, and the dream picture came back to him. The woman catching the little dog and raising her head as though to speak to him. "Plenty of time yet." Peter was speaking German instead of Spanish, as they always did between themselves. "They're still counting down from -3 hours. I just phoned the launching site for a jeep. Eugenio's been there ever since dinner. They say he's running around like a cat looking for a place to have her first litter of kittens." He chuckled. This would be something new for Eugenio Galvez, for which he could be thankful. "I hope the generators don't develop any last-second bugs," he said. "We'll only be 1.5 miles away, and that'll be too close to 50 kilos of nega matter if the field collapses." "It'll be all right," Peter assured him. "The bugs have all been chased out years ago." "Not out of those generators in the rocket. They're new." He fumbled in his coat pocket for his pipe and tobacco. "I never thought I'd run another nuclear bomb test as long as I lived." "Lee!" Pitov was shocked. "You mustn't call it that. It isn't that at all. It's purely a scientific experiment." "Wasn't that all any of them were? We made lots of experiments like this back before 1969. The memories of all those other tests, each ending in an Everest-high mushroom column, rose in his mind. And the end result, the United States and the Soviet Union blasted to rubble. A whole hemisphere pushed back into the dark ages, 250 million dead, including a slim woman with greying blonde hair, and a little red dog, and a girl from Odessa whom Alexis Petov had been going to marry. Forgive me, Alexis, I just couldn't help remembering. I suppose it's this shot we're going to make tonight. It's so much like the other ones before." He hesitated slightly. "Before the Auburn bomb." There he'd come out and said it. In all the years they'd worked together at the Instituto Argentino de Ciencia Física, that had been unmentioned between them. The families of hanged cutthroats avoid mention of ropes and knives. He thumbed the old-fashioned American lighter and held it to his pipe. Across the veranda, in the darkness, he knew that Pitov was looking intently at him. "You've been thinking about that lately, haven't you?" the Russian asked, and then, timidly, "Was that what you were dreaming of?" "Oh, no, thank heaven." "I think about it too, always. I suppose," he seemed relieved, now that it had been brought out into the open and could be discussed. "You saw it fall, didn't you?" "That's right, from about 30 miles away. A little closer than we'll be to this shot tonight. I was in charge of the investigation at Auburn, until we had New York and Washington and Detroit and Moberly and San Francisco to worry about. Then what had happened to Auburn wasn't important anymore. We were trying to get evidence to lay before the United Nations. We kept at it for about 12 hours after the United Nations had ceased to exist." "I could never understand about that, Lee. I don't know what the truth is. I probably never shall. But I know that my government did not launch that missile. During the first days after yours began coming in, I talked to people who had been in the Kremlin at the time. One had been in the presence of Klizenko himself when the news of your bombardment arrived. He said that Klizenko was absolutely stunned. We always believed that your government decided upon a preemptive surprise attack and picked out a town, Auburn, New York, that had been hit by one of our first retaliation missiles, and claimed that it had been hit first." He shook his head. "Auburn was hit an hour before the first American missile was launched. I know that to be a fact. We could never understand why you launched just that one, and no more until after ours began landing on you. Why you threw away the advantage of surprise and priority of attack. Because we didn't do it, Lee. The Russian's voice trembled with earnestness. You believe me when I tell you that? Yes, I believe you. After all that happened, and all that you, and I, and the people you worked with, and the people I worked with, and your government, and mine, have been guilty of, it would be a waste of breath for either of us to try to lie to the other about what happened 15 years ago. He drew slowly on his pipe. But who launched it then? It had to be launched by somebody. Don't you think I've been tormenting myself with that question for the last 15 years? Petov demanded. You know, there were people inside the Soviet Union, not many, and they kept themselves well hidden, who were dedicated to the overthrow of the Soviet regime. They, or some of them, might have thought that the devastation of both our countries and the obliteration of civilization in the Northern Hemisphere would be a cheap price to pay for ending the rule of the Communist Party. Could they have built an ICBM with a thermonuclear warhead in secret? He asked. There were also fanatical nationalist groups in Europe, both sides of the Iron Curtain, who might have thought our mutual destruction would be worth the risks involved. There was China and India. If your country and mine wiped each other out, they could go back to the old ways and the old traditions. Or Japan, or the Muslim states. In the end, they all went down along with us, but what criminal ever expects to fall? We have too many suspects, and the trail's too cold, Alexis. That rocket wouldn't have had to have been launched anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. For instance, our friends here in the Argentine have been doing very well by themselves since El Coloso del Norte went down. And there were the Australians, picking themselves up bargains in real estate in the East Indies at gunpoint. And there were the Boers trekking north again, in tanks instead of ox wagons. And Brazil, with a not too implausible pretender to the Braganza throne, calling itself the Portuguese Empire, and looking eastward. And to complete the picture, here were Professor Dr. Lee Richardson and Comrade Professor Alexis Petrovich Petov, getting ready to test a missile with a matter annihilation warhead. No, this thing just wasn't a weapon. A jeep came round the corner, lighting the dark roadway between the bungalows, its radio on and counting down. 22 minutes, 21, 59, 58, 57. It came to a stop in front of their bungalow at exactly -2 hours, 21 minutes, 54 seconds. The driver called out in Spanish, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Petov, are you ready? Yes, ready, we're coming. They both got to their feet, Richardson pulling himself up reluctantly. The older you get, the harder it is to leave a comfortable chair. He settled himself beside his colleague and former enemy, and the jeep started again, rolling between the buildings of the living quarters area and out onto the long straight road across the pampas toward the distant blaze of electric lights. He wondered why he had been thinking so much lately about the Auburn bomb. He'd questioned at times, indignantly of course, whether Russia had launched it. But it wasn't until tonight, until he had heard what Petov had to say, that he seriously doubted it. Petov wouldn't lie about it, and Petov would have been in a position to have known the truth if the missile had been launched from Russia. Then he stopped thinking about what was water, or blood, a long time over the dam. The special policeman at the entrance to the launching site reminded them that they were both smoking. When they extinguished, respectively, their cigarette and pipe, he waved the jeep on and went back to his argument with a carload of tourists who who wanted to get a good view of the launching. "There now, Lee. Do you need anything else to convince you that this isn't a weapon project?" Pitov asked. "No, now that you mention it, I don't. You know, I don't believe I've had to show an identity card the whole time I've been here." "I don't believe I have an identity card," Pitov said. "Think of that." The lights blazed everywhere around them, but mostly about the rocket that towered above everything else, so thick that it seemed squat. The gantry cranes had been hauled away now, and it stood alone, but it was still wreathed in thick electric cables. They were pouring enough current into that thing to light half the streetlights in Buenos Aires. When the cables were blown free by separation charges at the blast-off, the generators powered by the rocket engines had better be able to take over, because if the magnetic field collapsed and that 50-kilo chunk of negative proton matter came in contact with natural positive proton matter, an old-fashioned H-bomb would be a firecracker to what would happen. Just 100 kilos of pure 200 proof MC2. The driver took them around the rocket, dodging assorted trucks and mobile machinery that were being hurried out of the way. The countdown was just beyond 2 hours, 5 minutes. The jeep stopped at the edge of a crowd around 3 more trucks, and Dr. Eugenio Galvez, the director of the institute, left the crowd and approached at an awkward half-run as they got down. "Is everything checked, gentlemen?" he wanted to know. "It was this afternoon at 17:30, Pitov told him, "and nobody's been burning my telephone to report anything different. Are the balloons and the drone planes ready?" "The Air Force just finished checking. They're ready. Captain Urquhart flew one of the planes over the course and made a guidance tape. That's been duplicated, and all the planes are equipped with copies." "How's the wind?" Richardson asked. "Still steady. We won't have any trouble about fallout or the balloons." "Then we'd better go back to the bunker and make sure everybody there is on the job." The loudspeaker was counting down to 2 hours, 1 minute. "Could you spare a few minutes to talk to the press?" Eugenio Galvez asked, "and perhaps say a few words for telecast? This last is most important. We can't explain too many times the purpose of this experiment. There is still much hostility arising from fear that we are testing a nuclear weapon." The press and telecast services were well represented. There were close to 100 correspondents from all over South America, from South Africa and Australia, even one from Ceylon. They had 3 trucks with mobile telecast pickups, and when they saw who was approaching, they released the 2 rocketry experts they had been quizzing and pounced on their new victims. Was there any possibility that negative proton matter might be used as a weapon? "Anything can be used as a weapon. You could stab a man to death with that lead pencil you're using," Pitov replied. "But I doubt if matter will ever be so used. We're certainly not working on weapons design here. We started 6 years ago with the ability to produce negative protons, reverse spin neutrons, and positrons, and the theoretical possibility of assembling them into matter. We have just gotten a 50-kilogram mass of iron assembled. In those 6 years, we had to invent all our techniques and design all our equipment. If we'd been insane enough to want to build a nuclear weapon, after what we went through up north, we could have done so from memory and designed a better, which is to say, a worse, one from memory in a few days. Yes, and building a matter bomb for military purposes would be like digging a 50-foot shaft to get a rock to bash somebody's head in, when you could do the job better with the shovel you're digging with," Richardson added. "The time, money, energy and work we put in on this thing would be ample to construct 20 thermonuclear bombs, and that's only a small part of it." He went on to tell them about the magnetic bottle inside the rocket's warhead, mentioning how much electric current was needed to keep up the magnetic field that insulated the matter from contact with posimatter. "Then what was the purpose of this experiment, Dr. Richardson?" Oh, we were just trying to find out a few basic facts about natural structure. Long ago, it was realized that the nucleonic particles, protons, neutrons, mesons, and so on, must have structure of their own. Since we started constructing negative proton matter, we found out a few things about nucleonic structure, some rather odd things, including fractions of Planck's constant. A couple of the correspondents, a man from La Prensa and an Australian, whistled softly. The others looked blank. Pitov took over. You see, gentlemen, most of what we learned from putting negamatter atoms together. We annihilated a few of them. Over there in that little concrete building, we have one of the most massive steel vaults in the world, where we do that. But we assembled millions of them for every one we annihilated, and that chunk of nega iron inside the magnetic bottle kept growing. And when you have a piece of negamatter you don't want, you can't just throw it out on the scrap pile. We might have rocketed it into an escape velocity and let it blow up in space, away from the moon or any of the artificial satellites. But why waste it? So we're going to have the rocket eject it, and when it falls, we can see by our telemetered instruments just what happens. Well, won't it be annihilated by contact with atmosphere? Somebody asked. That's one of the things we want to find out, Pitov said. We estimate about 20% loss from contact with atmosphere, but the mass that actually lands on the target area should be about 40 kilos. It should be something of a spectacle coming down. You say you had to assemble it after creating the negative protons and neutrons and the positrons. Doesn't any of this sort of matter exist in nature? The man who asked that knew better himself. He just wanted the answer on the record. Oh no, not on this planet, and probably not in the galaxy. There may be whole galaxies composed of nothing but negamatter. There may even be isolated stars and planetary systems inside our galaxy composed of negamatter, though I think that very improbable. But when negamatter and posimatter come into contact with one another, the result is immediate mutual annihilation. They managed to get away from the press, and returned as far as the bunkers, 1.5 miles away. Before they went inside, Richardson glanced up at the sky, fixing the location of a few of the more conspicuous stars in his mind. There were almost 100 men and women inside. Each had his or her instruments, view screens, radar indicators, detection instruments of a dozen kinds. The reporters and telecast people arrived shortly afterward, and Eugenio Galvez took them in tow. While Richardson and Pitov were making their last minute's rounds, the countdown progressed past -1 hour, and at -20 minutes all the overhead lights went off, and the small instrument operator's lights came on. Pitov turned on a couple of view screens, one from a pickup on the roof of the bunker and another from the launching pad. They sat down side by side and waited. Richardson got his pipe out and began loading it. The loudspeaker was saying, -2 minutes, 1:59, 58, 57. He let his mind drift away from the test, back to the world that had been smashed around his ears in the autumn of 1969. He was doing that so often now, when he should be thinking about 2 seconds, 1 second, firing. It was a second later that his eyes focused on the left-hand view screen. Red and yellow flames were gushing out at the bottom of the rocket, and it was beginning to tremble. Then the upper jets, the ones that furnished power for the generators, began firing. He looked anxiously at the meters. The generators were building up power. Finally, when he was sure that the rocket would be blasting off anyhow, the separator charges fired, and the heavy cables fell away. An instant later, the big missile started inching upward, gaining speed by the second, first slowly and jerkily, and then more rapidly, until it passed out of the field of the pickup. He watched the rising spout of fire from the other screen until it passed from sight. By that time, Pitov had twisted a dial and gotten another view of the left-hand screen, this time from close to the target. That camera was radar-controlled. It had fastened onto the approaching missile, which was still invisible. The stars swung slowly across the screen until Richardson recognized the ones he had spotted at the zenith. In a moment now, the rocket, 100 miles overhead, would be nosing down, and then the warhead would open, and the magnetic field inside would alter, and the mass of negamatter would be ejected. The stars were blotted out by a sudden glow of light. Even at 100 miles, there was enough atmospheric density to produce considerable energy release. Pitov, beside him, was muttering, partly in German and partly in Russian. Most of what Richardson caught was figures, trying to calculate how much of the mass of unnatural iron would get down for the ground blast. Then the right-hand screen broke into a wriggling orgy of color, and at the same time every scrap of radio-transmitted apparatus either went out or began reporting erratically. The left-hand screen, connected by wiring to the pickup on the roof, was still functioning. For a moment, Richardson wondered what was going on, and then shocked recognition drove that from his mind as he stared at the ever-brightening glare in the sky. It was the Auburn bomb again. He was back, in memory, to the night on the shore of Lake Ontario, the party breaking up in the early hours of morning. He and Janet and the people with whom they had been spending a vacation week standing on the lawn as the guests were getting into their cars. And then the sudden light in the sky, the cries of surprise, and then of alarm as it seemed to be rushing straight down upon them. He and Janet, clutching each other and staring up in terror at the falling blaze from which there seemed no escape. Then relief as it curved away from them and fell to the south. And then the explosion, lighting the whole southern sky. There was a similar explosion in the screen when the mass of nega iron landed, a sheet of pure white light, so bright and so quick as to almost pass above the limit of visibility, and then a moment's darkness that was in his stunned eyes more than in the screen, and then the rising glow of updrawn incandescent dust. Before the sound waves had reached them, he had been legging it into the house. The television had been on, and it had been acting as insanely as the screen on his right now. He had called the state police. The telephones had been working all right, and told them who he was, and they had told him to stay put, and they'd send a car for him. They did, within minutes. Janet and his host and hostess had waited with him on the lawn until it came, and after he had gotten into it, he had turned around and looked back through the rear window, and seen Janet standing under the front light, holding the little dog in her arms, flopping one of its silly little paws up and down with a hand to wave goodbye to him. He had seen her and the dog like that every day of his life for the last 15 years. "What kind of radiation are you getting?" he could hear Alexis Pitov asking into her phone. "What? Nothing else?" "Oh, yes, of course, but mostly cosmic. That shouldn't last long." He turned from the phone. "A devil's own dose of cosmic and some gamma. It was the cosmic radiation that put the radios and telescreens out. That's why I insisted that the drone planes be independent of radio control." They always got cosmic radiation from the micro-annihilations in the test vault. Well, now they had an idea of what produced natural cosmic rays. There must be quite a bit of negamatter and posimatter going into mutual annihilation and total energy release through the universe. Of course, there were no detectors set up in advance around Auburn, he said. We didn't really begin to find anything out for half an hour. By that time, the cosmic radiation was over, and we weren't getting anything but gamma. What? What has Auburn to do? The Russian stopped short. You think this was the same thing? He gave it a moment's consideration. Lee, you're crazy. There wasn't an atom of artificial negamatter in the world in 1969. Nobody had made any before us. We gave each other some scientific surprises then, but nobody surprised both of us. You and I, between us, knew everything that was going on in nuclear physics in the world, and you know as well as I do. A voice came out of the public address speaker. Some of the radio equipment around the target area that wasn't knocked out by blast is beginning to function again. There is an increasingly heavy gamma radiation, but no more cosmic rays. They were all prompt radiation from the annihilation. The gamma is secondary effect. Wait a moment. Captain Urquiola of the Air Force said that the first drone plane is about to take off. It had been 2 hours after the blast that the first drones had gone over what had been Auburn, New York. He was trying to remember, as exactly as possible, what had been learned from them. Gamma radiation. A great deal of gamma. But it didn't last long. It had been almost down to a safe level by the time the investigation had been called off, and 2 months after there had been no more missiles, and no way of producing more, and no targets to send them against if they'd had them. Rather, he had been back at Auburn on his hopeless quest, and there had been almost no trace of radiation. Nothing but a wide, shallow crater, almost 200 feet in diameter, and only 15 at its deepest, already full of water, and a circle of flattened and scattered rubble for 1.5 miles all around it. He was willing to bet anything that that was what I'd find where the chunk of nega iron had landed, 50 miles away on the pampas. Well, the first drone ought to be over the target area before long, and at least one of the balloons that had been sent up was reporting its course by radio. The radios in the others were silent, and the recording counters had probably jammed in all of them. There'd be something of interest when the first drone came back. He dragged his mind back to the present and went to work with Alexis Petov. They were at it all night, checking, evaluating, making sure that the masses of data that were coming in were being promptly processed for programming the computers. At each of the increasingly frequent coffee breaks, he noticed Petov looking curiously. He said nothing, however, until long after dawn. They stood outside the bunker, waiting for the jeep that would take them back to their bungalow, and watching the line of trucks, Argentine army engineers, locally hired laborers, load after load of prefab huts and equipment, going down toward the target area where they would be working for the next week. Lee, were you serious? Petov asked. I mean, about this being like the one at Auburn. It was exactly like Auburn, even that blazing light that came rushing down out of the sky. I wondered about that at the time. What kind of a missile would produce an effect like that? Now I know. We just launched one like it. But that's impossible. I told you, between us, we know everything that was happening in nuclear physics then. Nobody in the world knew how to assemble atoms of negamatter and build them into masses. Nobody and nothing on this planet built that mass of negamatter. I doubt if it even came from this galaxy. But we didn't know that then. When that negamatter meteor fell, the only thing anybody could think of was that it had been a Soviet missile. If it had hit around Leningrad or Moscow or Kharkov, who would you have blamed it on?
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Wait for Wait by Jack McKenty. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, October 1952. Narrated by Tom Trussel. When Dr. Allport Brinton's alarm clock sounded, it brought madness. It was very clever. It not only rang chimes of amazing penetrating power, it turned on all the lights in the room, closed the window, and started his bath water running. But this morning it was not appreciated. In fact, as Dr. Brinton got out of bed, he silently called down evil on the technician who had built it for him. The off switch was on the wall farthest away from his bed, and was controlled by a hair-trigger combination dial that couldn't be operated by anyone not fully awake. Dr. Brinton fumbled for a while, then gave up and started looking for his bedroom slippers. They had apparently crawled away during the night. He padded into his bathroom barefoot. He was about to see what a hot bath would do for what he had already diagnosed as a histamine headache, when the alarm clock, having decided that anyone who could sleep through 10 minutes of chiming was unwakeable, stopped chiming, turned off the lights, opened the window, and let all the water out. Dr. Brinton was walking back toward the light switch when he tripped on his bedroom slippers and fell back into bed. No further invitation was necessary. He slept till noon. Dr. Brinton unmistakably had a hangover. Considering the party he had attended the night before, it was not surprising. Actually, it was remarkable that he had been able to get out of bed at all. During the 14 years that the Rocket Research Station had been in operation, the parties that were held every time another test flight resulted in failure had grown from a few drinks in somebody's room to a mammoth bust-up that left the whole place partially paralyzed for days afterward. First as chief chemist, and later as director of the station, Dr. Brinton had attended every one of the scores of parties during every one of the 14 years. It spoke well for his endurance to say that he was back at his office at 1 o'clock. Some people didn't make it until the next day. His secretary, who didn't drink, was one of the very few who were at work on time. She walked into his office and stood in front of his desk, tapping her foot. Her facial expression showed that she thought people who got drunk at parties were amoral, degenerate, and entirely unfit for administrative positions. Dr. Brinton, who had been mentally comparing the relative merits of prussic acid and hanging as pain relievers, sat up straight to prove that he was moral, alert, and ready for any problem that might come up. His secretary sniffed to indicate that she didn't believe him. Dr. Brinton dropped his eyes to admit that maybe he wasn't at his best at the moment, but it was only a temporary condition, and by tomorrow he would be okay. "In 2 minutes you'll wish you were dead," said his secretary. "Read this." She handed him a letter. He read it, and his knuckles cracked as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Senator McNeil coming to visit here!" he cried in alarm. Though his voice was squeaky, he was surprised to hear it at all. "Get me a line to Washington. Our top priority. Audrey at the Naval Department." The call was put through. "Commander Audrey, this is Brinton at the station. Joe McNeil is coming to visit us. Can you head him off?" "Yes, I know, but he's on one of his economy drives. We just did a test yesterday, and if he inspects this place now, we won't get enough money to build a pinball machine. Delay him a week, anyway." "Well, try. I'll arrange a tour for him as best as I can, but if he doesn't come, I'll be much happier. Let me know as soon as possible." "Fine. Goodbye." He scribbled a memo and carried it out to his secretary. "Copy of this to all department heads right away. Phone the commissary and have them get all the decorations taken down in the dining room. Tell them to lay in some steaks for tomorrow. Phone Harry Sparding in public relations. Alert him VVIP tomorrow. Extra special tour including all our movies on the subject. I'm going over to the fuels department." Dr. Ferber, head of fuels, met Dr. Brinton at the door of his lab. "I just got your memo," he said. "Is that budget butcher really coming down here?" Dr. Brinton nodded his head gently. "I'm afraid so. I came over to see what kind of show we can put on for him." "We have some samples to run on the indoor motors. There are a couple of loads left for the acceleration sled, and I suppose if we work all night we could get a sergeant major ready, but if he's on an economy drive that might be too elaborate. Just a view of everybody pouring stuff from one test tube to another might be best." "Do the samples and run the sled once," Dr. Brinton said. "That should provide enough fire and noise. The rest of it will have to be fast talk. I think I'll go home to bed." Dr. Brinton considered himself a methodical man. He had bacon and eggs every morning for breakfast. He always took a vitamin pill with his afternoon coffee, and he was used to exactly 8 hours sleep. It was this last habit that caused him to wake up that night at midnight. He had gone to bed at 4 that afternoon, and habit is a hard thing to break. At first he thought it was morning, but a glance at his watch hanging on its illuminated pedestal corrected that. He grunted, rolled over, and waited for sleep to overtake him again. Nothing happened. He turned and stared at the ceiling for a while. Still nothing. He had not felt so wide awake for a long time. Then he was struck by one of the flashes of inspiration that had made him famous. He would raid the refrigerator. Downstairs, he found that his son Eric had anticipated him by 2 minutes and was busy setting the table with cheese, pickles, ice cream, peanut butter, and everything else necessary to keep a 16-year-old boy operating at peak efficiency. A pile of books on the table indicated that he had just finished his homework. Dr. Brinton was pleased that his son had worked so late, but the choice of food made him shudder. He rummaged in the refrigerator himself, found a cold pork chop that Eric had somehow overlooked, and bore it to the table in triumph. "We were dealt a blow today," he said between mouthfuls. "Oh?" said Eric, on guard in case it was about his schoolwork. "Received word that Senator McNeil is coming here tomorrow. No, today. It's after midnight." "Oh." It was an "oh" of relief. A senator couldn't be nearly as troublesome as a teacher. "Don't say oh like that. He'll probably close the station tight and we'll all be out of work. You don't realize it, but money has been getting harder and harder to cadge for this place. We're practically running only the fuels department now." He got up, threw the bone from his pork chop into a garbage pail, washed his hands at the sink, and sat down again. He continued, "Wait till he finds out about those 4 reactor rockets that are cooling off on the moon, waiting for us to get there. I can hear him scream, $5 million each full of precious equipment, to say nothing of invaluable fissionable material." And then this place gets shut down. Eric had a suggestion. "Give him the old routine about how we have to get men to the moon, or the Russians will do it first and use all the equipment we've sent there without even thanking us." Said his father, considering. He shook his head finally. "His answer to that is why send good money after bad? Now I just hope he feels better after a steak dinner. Either that, or the wings fall off his plane." He smiled wistfully at the thought. "Oh well," he said, "let's go to bed." They went their separate ways, but only Eric went to bed. His father entered the library, sat down, got his pipe going, and began to reread How to Win Friends and Influence People. The next day saw Dr. Brinton contemplate suicide, homicide, and voting Republican, though not necessarily in that order. The senator had viewed the most inspiring Onward and Upward movies, and merely asked how much they cost to make. He had eaten a huge steak at the commissary, and then inspected the garbage cans for waste. His visits to various departments had been marred by his lack of interest in anything except the number of men employed by each and their average salaries. though he did comment that they all looked hungover. In the fuels department, he had walked out on the demonstrations, interrupting some actual experiments that were going on outside the test room. Dr. Brinton was now riding in the back of a jeep, explaining to the senator that nuclear rockets were not too efficient, and the shielding necessary to make them safe for men weighed more than their payload. The senator noted down the word, inefficient. A loudspeaker on a pole a little farther down the road interrupted the explanation.
25, 25, 25,
it shouted.
59, 18, 59, 18, 73, 10, 8.
It began to repeat the message. The driver, who had slowed while they listened to the message, turned the jeep around and sped them back the other way. "What in heaven's name was that?" asked the senator, who was busy hanging on. 25 means emergency, shouted Dr. Brinton. 5 and 9 is fire and explosion in the fuels department, which is 18. 73 is my call number, and 10-8 means they want me to get there in a hurry. For the first time, the senator looked impressed. Then he grew angry again when his hat blew off and the driver wouldn't stop to go back and get it. The jeep took a shortcut across the concrete fence and left tire marks in the grass in front of the fuels department. Dr. Brinton jumped out and ran into the building, leaving the senator to argue with the driver about going back for the hat. The lab outside the test room was dusty and littered with broken glass. 2 technicians were receiving first aid for minor cuts, but everyone else seemed to be in an almost holiday mood. Dr. Ferber saw Dr. Brinton standing in the doorway and came over to him immediately. "That telephone operator gets too excited," he said. "There's no fire, and I think it was an implosion, not an explosion. Wrecked our new pressure catalyzer. Harrison's gone to hospital, and the 2 you see are hurt, but none of it's very serious. I suppose Butcher Boy is going to put this down in his little notebook, too." "If you're referring to me," said the senator's voice behind them, "I most certainly am going to make a note of it, and I suggest you both start advertising for other jobs." Brinton had been indulging in a pleasant little fantasy in which he had cut Senator McNeil up into 28 pieces, placed them in aluminium cans, and made them radioactive in the station pile. He was smiling at the newsreel cameras, about to fire the first senator-powered spaceship in the history of mankind, when his alarm clock, which had maliciously been waiting for just such an opportunity, spoiled his dream by waking him up. That was how the next day started. It continued in the same vein when, in a fit of petulance, he strode into his clothes closet and kicked the alarm control box barefoot. He was working the combination dial for the 3rd or 4th time when he noticed that his feet were getting wet. His kick must have jammed some relays in the control box. The bath water was overflowing. Since the box was sealed to prevent him from fooling with it, he had had to prevent a flood by limping downstairs and pulling the master switch. With no electricity, his breakfast consisted of cold fruit juice, cold cereal, and cold milk. When he got to his office, he ordered a pot of coffee and made out a requisition for a pipe wrench. If it ever happened again, he was going to shut the water off instead. His secretary came in with a coffee and poured him a cup. "I have some letters for you to sign," she said brightly, to cheer him up. Dr. Brinton drank his coffee. "Our new filing system is working very well," she added, pouring him another cup. The doctor's face relaxed a little, but it was because the snowbank in his stomach was beginning to melt. His secretary played her trump. "And somebody from the fuels department phoned and said something was passing the yellow line and might make the blue." She was never sure afterward whether Dr. Brinton had gone around his desk or over it. She had blinked, and by the time her eyes were open again, he was gone. Dr. Brinton found a crowd in the indoor test lab, chuckling over the line being drawn by a differential analyzer. He elbowed his way to the front, looked himself, and began a little dance of impatience. The analyzer was connected with linkages to the test stand where a tiny rocket motor was thrusting out a hot blue pencil of flame. The results from the analyzer were plotted as range capability against time on a piece of graph paper which had 4 curved coloured lines overprinted on it. The curved lines were marked in succession: Earth, Moon, Moon, and Earth. If the first Earth line, coloured red, was passed, the fuel under test could power a rocket to leave Earth, carrying men with it. If the yellow line, the first Moon line, was reached, the rocket could theoretically land men on the Moon. Several rockets, carrying dummy loads, had already tried and failed. Their fuels, though the best available, barely reached the yellow line when under test. The blue, second Moon line, was calculated to indicate an escape from the Moon without refueling, and the last line, in green, was a theoretically powered landing back on Earth. The pen of the analyzer had already passed the blue line and was more than halfway to the green. "This the stuff that was left in the catalyzer after the explosion yesterday," Dr. Ferber shouted to Dr. Brinton over the roar from the little engine. "It looked as if it would burn, so I tested it. Jackpot!" "What is it?" asked Dr. Brinton. "Supposed to be an artificial base for a perfume." The last word seemed louder because a test rocket just then ran out of fuel and grew silent. The tracing of the pen stopped a fraction short of the green line. Dr. Ferber continued in his normal voice while he busied himself with the connections of the engine. "We didn't have anything to do to put on a show for McNeil yesterday, so I told the lads to carry on with experiments on their own. It was Harrison who made this stuff. He was cut by flying glass and landed in the hospital. I phoned there this morning and found the damn fool doctor took his appendix out. Said he figured he might as well while Harrison was in there. He's still under the anaesthetic, and we won't be able to ask him anything for several hours." "Doesn't matter," said Dr. Brinton. "We know it works. We have to find out why it works. Got any left? We'll analyze it." The next few hours saw Dr. Brinton rapidly become a bitter and disillusioned man. When a qualitative test informed them that the presence of nitrogen meant they were going to have to use an even longer and more laborious process than the ordinary one, he uttered a few sentences that made a couple of nearby German exchange students wonder if perhaps they hadn't a portion missed in their English language learning. When he found that he had forgotten his pipe at home, and the analysis required too much of their attentions to allow him to go home and get it, he quoted a paragraph or two that earned him the undivided attention of everyone in the lab. But when he took the results over to a calculator and worked them out to carbon 281.6%, he had barely started the prologue when frustration overtook him, and he subsided, speechless. He was at a loss to say or do anything except mumble that 281.6% was impossible. Dr. Ferber came over and took the paper with the results from him. Everyone in the lab watched while he checked the calculations patiently. A delegation minutely checked the apparatus the two doctors had used. It was faultless. One person even went so far as to cast a suspicious look at the big automatic microbalance standing on its pedestal in the centre of the room. He weighed a piece of paper, wrote his name on it in pencil, and re-weighed it. The difference was satisfactory. For a few moments they all just stood and looked at each other. Then the whole lot of them set to work. A junior technician headed for the spectrograph came back in 3 minutes with a freshly developed spectral photograph and a puzzled look. He spent some time comparing both of them with the illustrations in a manual entitled "Structural Formulae as Indicated by Spectral Groupings." The two German exchange students made a few tries at finding the class of compound. They soon were deep in a technical discussion on their own language, the only recognizable words being Biere, Dummkopf, and damn. A senior research chemist tried crystallizing some and invented an entirely new swear word. With 4 helpers, Dr. Brinton and Dr. Ferber redid the combustion analysis in slightly less than twice the time it would have taken only one of them. Of course, they were assured of accuracy. Each step was checked at least twice by everyone. The result was still carbon 281.6%. Dr. Brinton escaped the ensuing mental paralysis, since he had already been through the experience once. He went over and began to study the figures written in on the side of the spectral photograph. Out of little more than idle curiosity, he compared the ratios of the rough quantitative estimate found spectrographically with a more accurate but impossible answer of the combustion microanalysis. While he was doing the necessary figuring, he listened sympathetically to the technician. The young man was complaining bitterly about things in general, and chemistry in particular. Chemical reference books came in for a special roasting, because either that lousy book is incomplete, or this structural formula is out of this world. That did it. Brinton got out a scratch pad and drew a little diagram. Then he went to talk to Dr. Ferber. "Would it be possible that Harrison started with a multi-ringed phenol?" he asked. Dr. Ferber nodded. Dr. Brinton showed him the drawing. "Does that remind you of any geometrical figure?" Dr. Ferber looked. There was a pause. Then his eyes lit up. "Of course," he said. "Since formulae are usually drawn in one plane, I doubt if anyone ever noticed that before. And when it comes under stress by compression, it's only natural that it should fold." He paused and looked at the calendar. 4 weeks?" he asked. "That'll do fine," said Dr. Brinton. "I'll arrange the details. You look after the fuel. Harrison can give us the details of this one, but there are probably any number of fuels based on this principle. Some will be even more efficient too." He excused himself, went to a phone, and asked for a Washington number. The call was answered. "Hello, Senator McNeil," he said. "How would you like to be guest of honor at a party?" Brinton peered through the ring of reporters over to the head table where Senator McNeil was speaking and speaking and speaking. "He's on his home state," Dr. Brinton said, "about half an hour ago. Now, gentlemen, you are asking about the new fuel. You all received press handouts containing the information. You will probably receive copies of the Senator's speech, and the broadcast from our first men on the moon went out over several networks hours ago. It seemed to me that you have enough for several stories." One of the reporters asked bewilderedly, "What is a tesseract? I read the handout twice and I still don't understand." "A mathematician would be better qualified to explain," said Dr. Brinton, "but I'll try. A tesseract is a fourth-dimensional cube. A line has 1 dimension, a square has 2, a cube has 3, and a tesseract has 4. A cube can be unfolded into 6 squares, and a tesseract unfolds to 8 cubes. The new fuel had a molecular structure resembling an unfolded tesseract. When pressure is applied, it folds up into a tesseract so that it takes up less room and relieves the pressure. The practical application is that we can get 8 pounds of it into 1 pound can. The other 7 pounds of it are riding around in the 4th dimension. As soon as it starts to burn, the structure is destroyed so that it comes back out of the 4th dimension. Several people have assured me that it can't work. They're probably right, except that it does. Oh, I'll be back in a minute." He went over to another group and spoke to one of its members. The man addressed nodded his head and left. Dr. Brinton returned. "If there are no more questions, I suggest we do some serious drinking. I am now out of a job and I want to celebrate." Promptly at 7:30, a relay clicked and the alarm clock went into its usual daily routine with the chimes, window, lights, and bath water. Dr. Brinton woke up enough to reach out a lazy arm and flip a newly installed toggle switch beside his bed. Everything returned to normal. The light and the chimes both faded away, the window reopened, and a soft gurgling came from the bathroom. A slight gurgling also came from the bed, where Dr. Brinton, with a happy little smile on his face, had gone peacefully back to sleep, perfectly satisfied that he had worked himself into unemployment by finding the fuel that would power spaceships to, and from, any part of the solar system.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Let's Get Together by Isaac Asimov. Originally published in Infinity, February 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. A kind of peace had endured for a century, and people had forgotten what anything else was like. They would scarcely have known how to react had they discovered that a kind of war had finally come. Certainly, Elias Lynn, chief of the Bureau of Robotics, wasn't sure how he ought to react when he finally found out. The Bureau of Robotics was headquartered in Cheyenne, in line with the century-old trend towards decentralization, and Lynn stared dubiously at the young security officer from Washington who had brought the news. Elias Lynn was a large man, almost charmingly homely, with pale blue eyes that bulged a bit. Men weren't usually comfortable under the stare of those eyes, but the security officer remained calm. Lynn decided that his first reaction ought to be incredulity. Hell, it was incredulity. He just didn't believe it. He eased himself back in his chair and said, "How certain is the information?" The security officer, who had introduced himself as Ralph G. Breckenridge and had presented the credentials to match, had the softness of youth about him, full lips, plump cheeks that flushed easily, and guileless eyes. His clothing was out of line with Cheyenne, but it suited a universally air-conditioned Washington, where security, despite everything, was still centered. Breckenridge flushed and said, "There's no doubt about it." "You people know all about them, I suppose," said Lynn, and was unable to keep a trace of sarcasm out of his tone. He was not particularly aware of his use of a slightly stressed pronoun in his reference to the enemy, the equivalent of capitalization in print. It was a cultural habit of his generation and the one preceding. No one said the East, or the Reds, or the Soviets, or the Russians anymore. That would have been too confusing, since some of them weren't of the East, weren't Reds, Soviets, and especially not Russians. It was much simpler to say we and they, and much more precise. Travellers had frequently reported that they did the same in reverse. Over there, they were we, in the appropriate language, and we were they. Scarcely anyone gave thought to such things anymore. It was all quite comfortable and casual. There was no hatred even. At the beginning it had been called a Cold War. Now it was only a game, almost a good-natured game, with unspoken rules and a kind of decency about it. Lynn said abruptly, "Why should they want to disturb the situation?" He rose and stood staring at a wall map of the world, split into two regions with faint edgings of colour. An irregular portion of the left of the map was edged in a mild green. A smaller, but just as irregular, portion of the right of the map was bordered in a washed-out pink. We and they. The map hadn't changed much in a century. The loss of Formosa and the gain of East Germany some 80 years before had been the last territorial switch of importance. There had been another change, though, that was significant enough, and that was in the colours. 2 generations before, the territory had been a brooding, bloody red,
ours a pure and undefiled white. Now there was a neutrality about the colours. Lynn had seen their maps, and it was the same on their side. "They wouldn't do it," he said. "They are doing it," said Breckenridge, "and you had better accustom yourself to the fact. Of course, sir, I realize that it isn't pleasant to think that they may be that far ahead of us in robotics." His eyes remained as guileless as ever, but the hidden knife edges of the words plunged deep, and Lynn quivered at the impact. Of course, that would account for why the chief of robotics learnt of this so late, and through a security officer at that. He had lost caste in the eyes of the government. If robotics had really failed in the struggle, Lynn could expect no political mercy. Lynn said warily, "Even if what you say is true, they're not far ahead of us. We could build humanoid robots." "Have we, sir?" "Yes. As a matter of fact, we have built a few models for experimental purposes." "They were doing so 10 years ago. They've made 10 years' progress since." Lynn was disturbed. He wondered if his incredulity concerning the whole business were really the result of wounded pride and fear for his job and reputation. He was embarrassed by the possibility that this might be so, and yet he was forced into defense. He said, "Look, young man, the stalemate between them and us was never perfect in every detail, you know. They have always been ahead in one facet or another, and we in some other facet or another. If they're ahead of us right now in robotics, it's because they've placed a greater proportion of their effort into robotics than we have. And that means that some other branch of endeavour has received a greater share of our efforts than it has of theirs. It would mean we're ahead in force field research or in hyperatomics, perhaps." Lynn felt distressed at his own statement that the stalemate wasn't perfect. It was true enough, but that was the one great danger threatening the world. The world depended on the stalemate being as perfect as possible. If the small unevenness that always existed overbalanced too far in one direction or the other. Almost at the beginning of what had been the Cold War, both sides had developed thermonuclear weapons, and war became unthinkable. Competition switched from the military to the economic and psychological and had stayed there ever since. But always there was the driving effort on each side to break the stalemate, to develop a parry for every possible thrust, to develop a thrust that could not be parried in time, something that would make war possible again. And that was not because either side wanted war so desperately, but because both were afraid that the other side would make the crucial discovery first. For 100 years each side had kept the struggle even, and in the process peace had been maintained for 100 years, while byproducts of the continuously intensive research, force fields had been produced, and solar energy and insect control and robots. Each side was making a beginning in the understanding of mentalics, which was a name given to the biochemistry and biophysics of thought. Each side has its outposts on the moon and on Mars. Mankind was advancing in giant strides under forced draft. It was even necessary for both sides to be as decent and humane as possible among themselves, lest through cruelty and tyranny friends be made for the other side. It couldn't be that the stalemate would now be broken, and that would be war. Lynn said, "I want to consult one of my men. I want his opinion." "Is he trustworthy?" Lynn looked disgusted. "Good Lord, what man in robotics has not been investigated and cleared to death by your people? Yes, I vouch for him. If you can't trust a man like Humphrey Carl Laszlo, then we're in no position to face the kind of attack you say they are launching, no matter what else we do." "I've heard of Laszlo," said Breckenridge. "Good. Does he pass?" "Yes." "Then I'll have him in, and we'll find out what he thinks about the possibility that robots could invade the USA." "Not exactly," said Breckenridge softly. "You still don't accept the full truth. Find out what he thinks about the fact that robots have already invaded the USA." Laszlo was the grandson of a Hungarian who had broken through what had then been called the Iron Curtain, and he had a comfortable above-suspicion feeling about himself because of it. He was thick-set and balding, with a pugnacious look graven forever on his snub face, but his accent was clear Harvard, and he had almost excessively soft-spoken. To Lynn, who was conscious that after years of administration he was no longer expert in the various phases of modern robotics, Laszlo was a comforting receptacle for complete knowledge. Lynn felt better because of the man's mere presence. Lynn said, "What do you think?" A scowl twisted Laszlo's face ferociously. "That they're that far ahead of us? Completely incredible. It would mean they've produced humanoids that could not be told from humans at close quarters. It would mean a considerable advance in robo-mentalics." "You're personally involved," said Breckenridge coldly. "Leaving professional pride out of account, exactly why is it impossible that they be ahead of us?" Laszlo shrugged. "I assure you that I'm well acquainted with their literature on robotics. I know approximately where they are." "You know approximately where they want you to think they are, is what you really mean," corrected Breckenridge. "Have you ever visited the other side?" "I haven't," said Laszlo shortly. "Nor you, Dr. Lynn?" Lynn said, "No, I haven't either." Breckenridge said, "Has any robotics man visited the other side in 25 years? He asked the question with a kind of confidence that indicated he knew the answer. For a matter of seconds, the atmosphere was heavy with thought. Discomfort crossed Laszlo's broad face. He said, "As a matter of fact, they haven't held any conferences on robotics in a long time." "In 25 years, said Breckenridge. "Isn't that significant?" "Maybe," said Laszlo reluctantly. "Something else bothers me, though. None of them have ever come to our conferences on robotics. None that I can remember." "Were they invited?" asked Breckenridge. Lynn, staring and worried, interposed quickly. "Of course." Breckenridge said, "Do they refuse attendance to any other types of scientific conferences we hold?" "I don't know," said Laszlo. He was pacing the floor now. "I haven't heard of any cases. Have you, Chief?" "No," said Lynn. Breckenridge said, "Wouldn't you say it was as though they didn't want to be put in the position of having to return any such invitation, or as though they were afraid one of their men might talk too much?" That was exactly how it seemed, and Lynn felt a helpless conviction that Security's story was true, after all, steal over him. Why else had there been no contact between sides on robotics? There had been a cross-fertilizing trickle of researchers moving in both directions on a strictly one-for-one basis for years, dating back to the days of Eisenhower and Khrushchev. There were a great many good motives for that: an honest appreciation of the supranational character of science, impulses of friendliness that are hard to wipe out completely in the individual human being, the desire to be exposed to a fresh and interesting outlook, and to have your own slightly stale notions greeted by others as fresh and interesting. The governments themselves were anxious that this continue. There was always the obvious thought that by learning all you could and telling as little as you could, your own side would gain by the exchange. But not in the case of robotics. Not there. Such a little thing to carry conviction, and a thing, moreover, they had known all along. Lynn thought darkly. We've taken the complacent way out. Because the other side had done nothing publicly on robotics, it had been tempting to sit back smugly and be comfortable in the assurance of superiority. Why hadn't it seemed possible, even likely, that they were hiding superior cards, a trump hand for the proper time? Laszlo said shakenly, "What do we do?" It was obvious that the same line of thought had carried the same conviction to him. "Do?" parroted Lynn. It was hard to think right now of anything but of the complete horror that came with conviction. There were 10 humanoid robots somewhere in the United States,
each one carrying a fragment of a TC bomb. TC. The race for sheer horror in bombery had ended there. TC. Total conversion. The sun was no longer a synonym one could use. Total conversion made the sun a penny candle. 10 humanoids, each completely harmless in separation, could, by the simple act of coming together, exceed critical mass and... Lynn rose to his feet heavily. The dark pouches under his eyes, which ordinarily lent his ugly face a look of savage foreboding, more prominent than ever. It's going to be up to us to figure out ways and means of telling a humanoid from a human, and then finding the humanoids. How quickly? Muttered Laszlo. Not later than 5 minutes before they get together, barked Lynn, and I don't know when that will be. Breckenridge nodded. I'm glad you're with us now, sir. I'm to bring you back to Washington for conference, you know. Lynn raised his eyebrows. All right. He wondered if, had he delayed longer in being convinced, he might not have been replaced forthwith, if some other chief of the Bureau of Robotics might not be conferring in Washington. He suddenly wished earnestly that exactly that had come to pass. The first presidential assistant was there, the Secretary of Science, the Secretary of Security, Lynn himself, and Breckenridge, 5 of them sitting about a table in the dungeons of an underground fortress near Washington. Presidential Assistant Jeffries was an impressive man, handsome in a white-haired and just a trifle jowly fashion, solid, thoughtful, and as unobtrusive politically as a presidential assistant ought to be. He spoke incisively. There are 3 questions that face us as I see it. First, when are the humanoids going to get together? Second, where are they going to get together? Third, how do we stop them before they get together? Secretary of Science Amberley nodded convulsively at that. He had been Dean of Northwestern Engineering before his appointment. He was thin, sharp-featured, and noticeably edgy. His forefinger traced slow circles on the table. As far as when they'll get together, he said, I suppose it's definite that it won't be for some time. Why do you say that? Asked Lynn sharply. They've been in the U.S. for at least a month already, so security says. Lynn turned automatically to look at Breckenridge, and Secretary of Security McAllister intercepted the glance. McAllister said, The information is reliable. Don't let Breckenridge's apparent youth fool you, Dr. Lynn. That's part of his value to us. Actually, he's 34 and has been with the department for 10 years. He has been in Moscow for nearly a year, and without him, none of this terrible danger would be known to us. As it is, we have most of the details. Not the crucial ones, said Lynn. McAllister of Security smiled frostily. His heavy chin and close-set eyes were well known to the public, but almost nothing else about him was. He said, We are all finitely human, Dr. Lynn. Agent Breckenridge has done a great deal. Presidential Assistant Jeffries cut in. Let us say we have a certain amount of time. If action at the instant were necessary, it would have happened before this. It seems likely that they are waiting for a specific time. If we knew the place, perhaps the time would become self-evident. If they're going to TC a target, they'll want to cripple us as much as possible, so it would seem that a major city would have to be it. In any case, a major metropolis is the only target worth a TC bomb. I think there are 4 possibilities. Washington as the administrative center, New York as the financial center, and Detroit and Pittsburgh as the 2 chief industrial centers. McAllister of Security said, I vote for New York. Administration and industry have both been decentralized to the point where the destruction of any one particular city won't prevent instant retaliation. Then why New York? Asked Amberley of Science, perhaps more sharply than he intended. Finance have been decentralized as well. A question of morale. It may be they intend to destroy our will to resist, to induce surrender by the sheer horror of the first blow. The greatest destruction of human life would be in the New York metropolitan area. Pretty cold-blooded, muttered Lynn. I know, said McAllister of Security, but they're capable of it, if they thought it would mean final victory at a stroke.
Wouldn't we? Presidential Assistant Jeffries brushed back his white hair. Let's assume the worst. Let's assume that New York will be destroyed sometime during the winter, preferably immediately after a serious blizzard when communications are at their worst and the disruption of utilities and food supplies in fringe areas will be most serious in their effect. Now, how do we stop them? Amberley of Science could only say, finding 10 men in 220 million is an awfully small needle in an awfully large haystack. Jeffries shook his head. You have it wrong. 10 humanoids among 220 million humans. No difference, said Amberley of Science. We don't know that a humanoid can be differentiated from a human at sight. Probably not. He looked at Lynn. They all did. Lynn said heavily, We in Cheyenne couldn't make one that would pass as human in the daylight. But they can, said McAllister of Security, and not only physically, we're sure of that. They've advanced mentalic procedures to the point where they can reel off the microelectronic pattern of the brain and focus it on the positronic pathways of the robot. Lynn stared. Are you implying that they can create the replica of a human being complete with personality and memory? I do. Of specific human beings? That's right. Is this also based on Agent Breckenridge's findings? Yes. The evidence can't be disputed. Lynn bent his head in thought for a moment. Then he said, Then 10 men in the United States are not men but humanoids. But the originals would have had to be available to them. They couldn't be Orientals, who would be too easy to spot, so they would have to be East Europeans. How would they be introduced into this country then? With a radar network over the entire world border as tight as a drum, how could they introduce any individual, human or humanoid, without our knowing it? McAllister of Security said, It can be done. There are certain legitimate seepages across the border. Businessmen, pilots, even tourists. They're watched, of course, on both sides. Still, 10 of them might have been kidnapped and used as models for humanoids. The humanoids would then be sent back in their place. Since we wouldn't expect such a substitution, it would pass us by. If they were Americans to begin with, there would be no difficulty in their getting into this country. It's as simple as that. And even their friends and family could not tell the difference. We must assume so. Believe me, we've been waiting for any report that might imply sudden attacks of amnesia or troublesome changes in personality. We've checked on thousands. Amberley of Science stared at his fingertips. I think ordinary measures won't work. The attack must come from the Bureau of Robotics, and I depend on the chief of that bureau. Again, eyes turned sharply, expectantly, on Lynn. Lynn felt bitterness rise. It seemed to him that this was what the conference came to, and was intended for. Nothing that had been said had not been said before. He was sure of that. There was no solution to the problem, no pregnant suggestion. It was a device for the record, a device on the part of men who gravely feared defeat, and who wished the responsibility for it placed clearly and unequivocally on someone else. And yet, there was justice in it. It was in robotics that we had fallen short, and Lynn was not Lynn merely. He was Lynn of robotics, and the responsibility had to be his. He said, I will do what I can. He spent a wakeful night, and there was a haggardness about both body and soul when he sought and attained another interview with Presidential Assistant Jeffries the next morning. Breckenridge was there, and though Lynn would have preferred a private conference, he could see the justice in the situation. It was obvious that Breckenridge had attained enormous influence with the government as a result of his successful intelligence work. Well, why not? Lynn said, Sir, I am considering the possibility that we are hopping uselessly to enemy piping. In what way? I'm sure that however impatient the public may grow at times, and however legislators sometimes find it expedient to talk, the government at least recognizes the world stalemate to be beneficial. They must recognize it also.
10 humanoids with 1 TC bomb is a trivial way of breaking the stalemate. The destruction of 15 million human beings is scarcely trivial. It is, from the world power standpoint. It would not so demoralize us as to make us surrender, or so cripple us as to convince us that we could not win. There would just be the same old planetary death war that both sides have avoided so long and so successfully. And all they would have accomplished is to force us to fight minus 1 city. It's not enough. "What do you suggest?" said Jeffries coldly. "That they do not have 10 humanoids in our country? That there is not a TC bomb waiting to get together?" "I'll agree that those things are here, but perhaps for some reason greater than just midwinter bomb madness." "Such as?" "It may be that the physical destruction resulting from the humanoids getting together is not the worst thing that can happen to us. What about the moral and intellectual destruction that comes with their being here at all? With all due respect to Agent Breckenridge, what if they intended for us to find out about the humanoids? What if the humanoids are never supposed to get together, but merely to remain separate in order to give us something to worry about? Why? Tell me this. What measures have already been taken against the humanoids? I suppose that security is going through the files of all citizens who have ever been across the border or close enough to it to make kidnapping possible. I know, since McAllister mentioned it yesterday, that they are following up suspicious psychiatric cases. What else?" Jeffries said, "Small X-ray devices are being installed in key places in large cities, in the mass arenas, for instance, where 10 humanoids might slip in among 100,000 spectators of a football game or an air polo match." "Exactly. And concert halls and churches. We must start somewhere. We can't do it all at once." "Particularly when panic must be avoided," said Lynn. "Isn't that so? It wouldn't do to have the public realize that at any unpredictable moment some unpredictable city and its human contents would suddenly cease to exist." "I suppose that's obvious. What are you driving at?" Lynn said strenuously. "That a growing fraction of our national effort will be diverted entirely into the nasty problem of what Amberley called finding a very small needle in a very large haystack. We'll be chasing our tails madly, while they increase their research lead to the point where we find we can no longer catch up, when we must surrender without the chance even of snapping our fingers in retaliation. Consider further that this news will leak out as more and more people become involved in our countermeasures and more people begin to guess what we're doing. Then what? The panic might do us more harm than any one TC bomb." The presidential assistant said irritably, "In heaven's name, man, what do you suggest we do then?" "Nothing," said Lynn. "Call their bluff. Live as we have lived and gamble that they won't dare break the stalemate for the sake of a 1-bomb head start." "Impossible," said Jeffries. "Completely impossible. The welfare of all of us is very largely in my hands, and doing nothing is the one thing I cannot do. I agree with you, perhaps, that X-ray machines at sports arenas are a kind of skin-deep measure that won't be effective, but it has to be done so that people, in the aftermath, do not come to the bitter conclusion that we tossed our country away for the sake of a subtle line of reasoning that encouraged do-nothingism. In fact, our counter-gambit will be active indeed." "In what way?" Presidential Assistant Jeffries looked at Breckenridge. The young security officer, hitherto calmly silent, said, "It's no use talking about a possible future break in the stalemate when the stalemate is broken now. It doesn't matter whether these humanoids explode or do not. Maybe they are only a bait to divert us, as you say. But the fact remains that we are a quarter of a century behind in robotics, and that may be fatal. What other advances in robotics will there be to surprise us if war does start? The only answer is to divert our entire force immediately, now, into a crash program of robotics research, and the first problem is to find the humanoids. Call it an exercise in robotics, if you will, or call it the prevention of the death of 15 million men, women, and children." Lynn shook his head helplessly. "You can't. You'll be playing into their hands. They want us lured into the one blind alley while they're free to advance in all other directions." Jeffries said impatiently, "That's your guess. Breckenridge has made his suggestion through channels and the government has approved, and we will begin with an all-science conference." "All science?" Breckenridge said. "We have listed every important scientist of every branch of natural science. They'll all be at Cheyenne. There will be only one point on the agenda: how to advance robotics. The major specific subheading under that will be how to develop a receiving device for the electromagnetic fields of the cerebral cortex that will be sufficiently delicate to distinguish between a protoplasmic human brain and a positronic humanoid brain." Jeffries said, "We had hoped you would be willing to be in charge of the conference." "I was not consulted in this." "Obviously time was short, sir. Do you agree to be in charge?" Lynn smiled briefly. It was a matter of responsibility again. The responsibility must be clearly that of Lynn of robotics. He had the feeling it would be Breckenridge who would really be in charge, but what could he do? He said, "I agree." Breckenridge and Lynn returned together to Cheyenne, where the evening Laszlo listened with a sullen mistrust to Lynn's description of coming events. Laszlo said, "While you were gone, Chief, I've started putting 5 experimental models of humanoid structure through the testing procedures. Our men are on a 12-hour day, with 3 shifts overlapping. If we've got to arrange a conference, we're going to be crowded and red-taped out of everything. Work will come to a halt." Breckenridge said, "That will be only temporary. You will gain more than you lose." Laszlo scowled. "A bunch of astrophysicists and geochemists around won't help a damn toward robotics. Views from specialists of other fields may be helpful." "Are you sure? How do we know that there is any way of detecting brain waves, or that, even if we can, there is a way of differentiating human and humanoid by wave pattern? Who set up the project anyway?" "I did," said Breckenridge. "You did? Are you a robotics man?" The young security agent said calmly. "I have studied robotics." "That's not the same thing." "I've had access to text material dealing with Russian robotics, in Russian. Top secret material well in advance of anything you have here." Lynn said ruefully, "He has us there, Laszlo." "It was on the basis of that material," Breckenridge went on, "that I suggested this particular line of investigation. It is reasonably certain that in copying off the electromagnetic pattern of a specific human mind into a specific positronic brain, a perfectly exact duplicate cannot be made. For one thing, the most complicated positronic brain, small enough to fit into a human-sized skull, is hundreds of times less complex than the human brain. It can't pick up all the overtones, therefore, and there must be some way to take advantage of that fact." Laszlo looked impressed despite himself, and Lynn smiled grimly. It was easy to resent Breckenridge and the coming intrusion of several hundred scientists of non-robotic specialties, but the problem itself was an intriguing one. There was that consolation at least. It came to him quietly. Lynn found he had nothing to do but sit in his office alone with an executive position that had grown merely titular. Perhaps that helped. It gave him time to think, to picture the creative scientists of half the world converging on Cheyenne. It was Breckenridge who, with cool efficiency, was handling the details of preparation. There had been a kind of confidence in the way he said, "Let's get together, and we'll lick them." Let's get together. It came to Lynn so quietly that anyone watching Lynn at that moment might have seen his eyes blink slowly twice, but surely nothing more. He did what he had to do with a whirling detachment that kept him calm when he felt that, by all rights, he ought to be going mad. He sought out Breckenridge in the others' improvised quarters. Breckenridge was alone and frowning. "Is anything wrong, sir?" Lynn said, wearily, "Everything's right, I think. I've invoked martial law." "What?" "As chief of a division, I can do so if I am of the opinion the situation warrants it. Over my division, I can then be dictator. Chalk up 1 for the beauties of decentralization." "You will rescind that order immediately," Breckenridge took a step forward. "When Washington hears this, you'll be ruined." "I'm ruined anyway. Do you think I don't realize that I've been set up for the role of the greatest villain in American history, the man who let them break the stalemate? I have nothing to lose, and perhaps a great deal to gain." He laughed a little wildly. "What a target the Division of Robotics will be, eh, Breckenridge? Only a few thousand men to be killed by a TC bomb capable of wiping out 300 square miles in 1 microsecond. But 500 of those men would be our greatest scientists. We would be in the peculiar position of having to fight a war with our brains shot out, or surrendering. I think we'd surrender." "But this is impossible, Lynn. Do you hear me? Do you understand? How could the humanoids pass our security provisions? How could they get together?" "But they are getting together. We're helping them to do so. We're ordering them to do so. Our scientists visit the other side, Breckenridge. They visit them regularly. You made a point of how strange it was that no one in robotics did. Well, 10 of those scientists are still there, and in their place 10 humanoids are converging on Cheyenne." "That's a ridiculous guess." "I think it's a good one, Breckenridge. But it wouldn't work unless we knew humanoids were in America, so that we would call the conference in the first place. Quite a coincidence that you brought the news of the humanoids and suggested the conference and suggested the agenda and are running the show and know exactly which scientists were invited. Did you make sure the right 10 were included?" "Dr. Lynn!" cried Breckenridge in outrage. He poised to rush forward. Lynn said, "Don't move. I've got a blaster here. We'll just wait for the scientists to get here one by one. One by one we'll X-ray them. One by one we'll monitor them for radioactivity. No two will get together without being checked. And if all 500 are clear, I'll give you my blaster and surrender to you. Only I think we'll find the 10 humanoids. Sit down, Breckenridge." They both sat. Lynn said, "We wait. When I'm tired, Laszlo will spell me. We wait." Professor Manuelo Jimenez of the Institute of Higher Studies of Buenos Aires exploded while the stratospheric jet on which they travelled on was 3 miles above the Amazon Valley. It was a simple chemical explosion, but it was enough to destroy the plane. Dr. Hermann Leibowitz of MIT exploded in a monorail, killing 20 people and injuring 100 others. In similar manner, Dr. Auguste Marin of l'Institut Nucléonique of Montreal and 7 others died at various stages of their journey to Cheyenne. Laszlo hurtled in, pale-faced and stammering, with the first news of it. It had only been 2 hours that Lynn had sat there, facing Breckenridge, blaster in hand. Laszlo said, "I thought you were nuts, Chief, but you were right. They were humanoids. They had to be." He turned to stare with hate-filled eyes at Breckenridge. "Only they were warned. He warned them, and now there won't be one left intact, not one to study." "God!" cried Lynn, and in a frenzy of haste thrust his blaster out toward Breckenridge and fired. The security man's neck vanished. The torso fell. The head dropped, thudded against the floor, and rolled crookedly. Lynn moaned. "I didn't understand. I thought he was a traitor, nothing more." And Laszlo stood immobile, mouth open, for the moment incapable of speech. Lynn said wildly, "Sure, he warned them. But how could he do so while sitting in that chair unless he were equipped with a built-in radio transmission? Don't you see it? Breckenridge had been in Moscow. The real Breckenridge is still there. Oh my God, there were 11 of them." Laszlo managed a hoarse squeak. "Why didn't he explode?" "He was hanging on, I suppose, to make sure the others had received his message and were safely destroyed. Lord, Lord, when you brought the news and I realized the truth, I couldn't shoot fast enough. God knows by how few seconds I may have beaten him to it." Laszlo said shakily, "At least we'll have one to study." He bent and put his fingers on the sticky fluid trickling out of the mangled remains at the neck end of the headless body. Not blood, but high-grade machine oil. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Formula for Murder by Milton A. Rothman, writing as Lee Gregor. Originally published in Infinity, November 1957. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Chapter 1. The figure of Professor Glover slipped from the surface of the space station and twinkled away among the stars. Jim Britton stared at it as though he could call it back by the ferocity of his gaze. He stood paralyzed by helplessness while the space-suited body plummeted off into the void, until he could no longer follow its motion towards the dazzling sun. Seized by an uncontrollable shaking, he dropped the radiophone antenna which he had ripped from Glover's back and flung himself down flat upon the surface of the station, where he clung while catching his breath. A vast donut, 25 miles in diameter, the space station stood with no apparent motion 1,000 miles above the surface of the earth. It floated in a sea of scintillating stars, like diamonds scattered upon a blackest velvet. "Jim, what's the matter?" John Callahan's voice grated in Britton's headpiece. "Glover's line broke loose," Britton gasped. "He's gone." "What?" "I'm coming back in. Give me a hand." Britton began the long crawl back to the entrance port, his nerves too shattered to attempt it standing up. He was several yards away when another space-suited figure emerged from the port and helped him stagger the rest of the way. Inside the airlock, he collapsed. In a small room within a large hospital, the two men sat talking. It was a featureless room with pale green walls, containing a desk, 2 soft chairs, and a leather couch. The doctor, middle-aged, inconspicuous, wearing glasses, a small moustache, and a grey suit, sat in one chair. Facing him in the other chair, Jim Britton, young, lean, and visibly depressed, wore pyjamas and a hospital robe. "You've been a sick boy," Morris Wolfe told Jim Britton in a conversational tone. "I guess so." Britton scratched at the arm of his chair and fingered the sleeve of his gown. "You're coming along, though. When you arrived at the hospital a week ago, you had to be wheeled in and fed like a baby. Now you've pulled out of the hole, and we're ready to do some real talking." "But, Doc, I don't know what happened, honestly. 1 minute Glover was starting to climb down into the iron source chamber, and the next minute his magnet line came loose, and when I grabbed after him I caught his phone antenna and ripped it off. Then I got the shakes, and the next thing I knew I was back on Earth in the hospital." The psychiatrist reached for his pipe and began to fill it from a large can on the desk. "It's a great shock to have the person next to you snuffed out like that," he said. "Some people can take it standing up. When you fall apart like that, we want to know the reason, so that it won't happen again." Britton shrugged. "What's the difference? I'll never work in a laboratory again, let alone the Lunatron. I'll never finish my research, and I'll never get my degree." His voice trailed off in a discouraged whisper. Wolfe watched him for a moment. "That kind of talk is the reason you are still here. You'll work in a laboratory again, and you'll get your degree. You're still not quite well. I'm here to help you get well." Britton shrugged again. "Okay, bring on the dancing girls," he said in a resigned tone. There were no dancing girls, however. Only a tall, blonde, squarish doctor in a white dress, who waited for them in the therapy room. Her cigarette made a cocky angle with the firm line of her mouth as she made final adjustments on the bank of electronic equipment that lined one whole wall. "Jim, this is Dr. Heller," Wolfe told him as they walked into the room. "She will work with us in here. Now suppose you get up on this table." The two husky attendants who were always in the background helped Britain onto the table and strapped him down. As Wolfe fastened the electrodes to Britain's head, he said conversationally, "In the old days, we would have just sat and talked to each other. It would have taken months to get to first base. Now we have ways of aiding the memory, of triggering associations, of lowering resistances to thoughts. It makes psychotherapy a much less tedious process than it used to be." As he spoke, he slipped a hypodermic needle into Britain's arm. "Now, suppose we see how much we can remember. Let's begin the day before Glover was killed. I want you to think back to that day and remember everything that happened, how you felt, what you thought about. We want to go through this traumatic experience of yours and relate it to the elements in your life which caused such a profound shock." And in addition, Wolfe thought bleakly to himself, a good many people were anxious to know other things. For example, was Glover's demise at this particular time a coincidence? The Atomic Energy Commission, though cagey about their reasons, had given top priority to the answers to their questions. The strength of official interest in this case was further evidenced by the assignment of Bill Grady and Calvin Jones as attendants to Jim Britton. For some time, Maurice Wolfe had wondered vaguely why two such clean-cut and alert young men should follow the low-paid calling of hospital attendant. Until recently, he had become aware that their pay checks actually came from the U.S. Treasury by way of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Now," Wolfe said, as Alma Heller switched on the tape recorder, "tell us what you remember." After a year of being stationed on the Lunatron, Jim Britton had the feeling of being fed up. Lunatics, they call us, he thought. Real crazy. Looking out of the ports, he saw a black starry space in which the only thing that ever changed was the view of the earth 1,000 miles below, and the moon, which was sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other. The stars were incredible jewels, and the sun was something that no one ever looked at with mortal eyes. There was bitterness in his heart as he thought of his initial thrill at being chosen to do his thesis research on the Lunatron. He had been an envied boy, but now, after a year, he would have given the chance to the first bidder. But there was no way to back out, short of breaking his contract or breaking his neck. Passage to and from Earth was too costly to be used on weekend vacations. Many people on Earth would have been excited by the chance to work for 2 years with Professor Glover on the 10,000 billion volt proton synchrotron, which they called the Lunatron. Most physicists thought they were lucky if they could spend a few months with the 50 billion volt antique at Brookhaven. But at Brookhaven, you were only a few minutes from New York. Up on the space laboratory, Britain was a year from any place, and every day that went by made it a day less. "Johnny, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get back to Rhodesia?" he asked his roommate. Britton sat, twanging half-heartedly at his guitar, while Johnny lay undressed on his bunk, his body hard and black against the white sheet. "Oh, I have a good job lined up in a brand new research institute in Salisbury." "I don't mean that," Britton said impatiently. Johnny was such a serious boy. "I mean, don't you think of all the fun you're going to have when you get back to Earth? Don't you think of getting a girlfriend and living like everybody else lives?" But Johnny's deep brown eyes remained serious, and he said, "Coming up here has been a great opportunity to learn something so that I will be able to do good work when I get back. Everybody down there does not get such a chance." Well, Britton thought, that's how it had been with him at first. Now he could think of nothing but walking arm in arm with a pretty girl, his girl, down the street of a big city at night, drinking in the excitement, the feeling of being with other people among the bright lights, under a sky that would be dark blue instead of black, that might have clouds in it, that might even send down rain, instead of being the stark, changeless interstellar space that existed up above. Scientists aren't supposed to have thoughts like these, but Britain was young, he was homesick, and he was bored. A young, homesick scientist cannot remain a solemn, dedicated, single-minded scientist. The next day at work, he absent-mindedly switched on some pieces of apparatus in the wrong order and burned out a minor piece of electronics. "Damn it, Britton!" Professor Glover shouted at him. "Where are your brains? Replacements are expensive up here. Time is expensive." Britton began shaking with rage. Words rushed to his tongue which he choked down unsaid because Glover had the power of life or death over his degree, and these 2 years must not be torn out of his life for nothing. "I'm sorry," he said in an unsteady voice. "I guess I'm not all here today. It won't take long to repair the damage." "Never mind," Glover said. "You're coming off the project anyway." Britton stood still. The anger roared back into his head. "I'm coming off the project? What happens to the year I've just spent?" Glover suddenly seemed more embarrassed than angry. "I'm sorry, Britton," he said, "but it's for your own good. The project has just become classified, and you'd never get a publishable thesis out of it." Britton stood there, looking at Glover. "This is a hell of a time to tell me," he exploded finally. "What's become so secret about this experiment?" "Obviously, I can't tell you. I'm sorry, but we'll make it up to you somehow. We'll think of something you can do while you're here, and if necessary, you can stay a little longer." "Stay longer?" Outraged, Britton fled to his room. It was all he could do to stick out the remainder of his 2 years. He could not sleep that night. Little teeth of anger nibbled into his mind, while the basic question repeated itself in endless circles. Why had his experiment been pulled out from under him? Fundamental experiments in high-energy particle physics were not generally classified secret. What were they doing which had suddenly become so important? The general purpose of the space laboratory was to gather basic information about the laws of nature. The optical telescope studied the planets as well as the farthest nebulae, unimpeded by atmospheric disturbances. The tremendous 25-mile diameter radio telescope pinpointed short-wave radio vibrations from all parts of space. The solid-state group could study the properties of matter in a vacuum chamber of rarity unattainable anywhere on Earth. In Jim Britton's group, known variously as the Elementary Particle Division, the Lunatron Group, or simply as the Lunatics, the topic of investigation was the meson. A long time ago, people had considered atoms the most elementary particles. Then they found out about protons and neutrons, which were the bricks that made up the atomic nuclei. A little later, when scientists learned how to build atom smashers such as the 2 billion volt proton synchrotron, they found that they could knock mesons out of the nucleus, and they decided that the protons and neutrons were not so simple after all. Year after year, the atom smashers had become bigger and bigger. There came a time when they could not be built on the surface of the Earth any longer, so a space laboratory was conceived, built around the donut of the 10,000 billion volt proton synchrotron. Protons, whirling around for thousands of cycles in this vast donut, 80 miles in circumference, could acquire energies equal to those of the most powerful cosmic rays. Even mesons shattered at this energy. By inspecting the remnants of these broken mesons, scientists could begin to get some idea as to the ultimate structure of matter and energy. Now, Jim Britton thought, what was there about this work that should suddenly become too secret to be published? Peace had reigned on Earth for many years, and it was once more fashionable to think of science as being free and unbound by security regulations. But not, apparently, here in Glover's private domain. Rephrase the question, Britain thought. What was there about this work which had suddenly made it desirable for Professor Glover to take Britain off the project? Was there more to this experiment than Britain had seen up to the present? Sitting through the night, Britain thought and calculated, filling his desktop with paper, feeling the frustration of a scientist who spends day after day with the details of an experiment, pushing buttons, reading meters, soldering wires, until he begins to lose sight of the ultimate aim of the project. As he fell asleep, long towards morning, his anger was still at a furious temperature, filling his mind with dreams of a tormented, violent nature, which he forgot promptly upon awakening. Professor Glover stopped by to see him as he ate a late breakfast. "We have a job to do today," Glover said, his voice tinged with an impersonal annoyance that was not directed at Britain. Britain stared up at Glover with a hostility that made no impression upon the scientist. "The iron source has gone bad and has to be replaced," Glover continued. "The spacesuits are being readied in the airlock." "Why us?" Britain complained. "What's the matter with the maintenance crew?" Glover's frown deepened. "They're busy with other things. You're free for the moment, and so am I." Then his face cleared, and he slapped Britain on the back. "Come on, fella, snap out of it. It'll do us both good to put on the suits and get out in free space." Britain uttered grumbling noises about, "A guy can't even finish a cup of coffee," and followed Glover out to the maintenance lock nearest the iron source. As he climbed out of the airlock, there again came the sensation of vertigo which he felt every time he stood on this island suspended in nothingness. The circumference of the donut stretched its great arc away from him in both directions, while 12 miles away, at the centre of the circle, was the spherical shape of the radio telescope receiver. The long, slender girders which bound the station together had a fragile, spidery appearance. Britain and Glover walked clumsily to the linear accelerator which projected 1 billion volt protons into the initial lap of their long journey around the donut. At the far end of the 100-foot tube, within a shielded chamber, was the glass bottle of the iron source. Normally, a brilliant crimson flame glowed within this bottle as numberless protons were stripped from their electrons to be hurled down the accelerator tubes. Now there was nothing but the blackened, dead glass. As they approached the chamber that surrounded the iron source, Britain found that the resentment left over from the previous night had a new object upon which to fasten. Why should he be doing the work that belonged to the technicians? In his anger, he lost sight of the fact that Professor Glover was out there doing the same thing. Damned slave labour, he thought. A PhD candidate was at the bottom of the heap, the lowest form of existence, pushed around by everybody else. Glover thought it was being clever, pushing him off the project, making excuses about security, when probably his aim was to keep for himself the noble prize that the experiment was going to receive some day. Thought he could keep his poor stupid student in the dark about the outcome of the experiment. But the poor student wasn't as stupid as he thought. Glover reached the hatch that opened into the iron source chamber and started undoing the fastenings. Suddenly he turned and stared at Britain. "Where's the new iron source?" he snapped. "Don't tell me you left it in the airlock." Britain stammered wordlessly, shocked out of his reverie. "Well, of all the stupid, go back and get it. I'll remove the old source." Glover turned his back and continued to unfasten the hatch. Rage came into full bloom instantly. Without an instant's thought, Britain reached out both hands, wrenched the antenna rod from Glover's back, tore his anchoring lines from their snaps, and pushed the struggling body out into space, where it soon dwindled away into a tiny speck. Chapter 2. Dr. Maurice Wolfe leaned back in his chair after Jim Britton was wheeled, asleep, from the therapy room. In a random fashion, he let his mind wander over the story he had just heard, savouring not only the facts, but the feelings behind them, and the intuitions which they built up in his own mind. "Well, Alma, what do you think?" he said, swivelling his chair to look at the other doctor across his desk. She hesitated. "The story seems satisfactory, up to a point. That is, we've broken through the memory block and have determined that Glover's death was not really an accident, which of course we suspected all along. And we have a motive, of a sort." Wolfe sighed. "Yes, the motive. The boy feels that Glover is cutting him out of the credit for an important experiment, so in a burst of anger he disposes of the professor. There are just two things that bother me about that. Look." He switched on his desk projector and ran through the microfilm card on Britton's record until he came to the examinations which Britton had taken to get to the post on the space station. "Here we have the standard Jameson test for paranoid personality. Obviously an important item in an examination of this sort. You wouldn't send even an incipient paranoid into close quarters with a group of people for 2 years. And so in the case of Jim Britton, the Jameson test gives a negative result. No evidence of any paranoia, and in fact no evidence of any neurosis except the drive to do research." Alma Heller lit a cigarette thoughtfully. "I see. No paranoia predicted, yet the story he tells us now is a typical textbook example of persecution psychosis. Of course," she paused for a moment, "he might be making up this story to hide his real motive." Wolfe shook his head vigorously. "No dice. Not under deep therapy. He has to tell us the truth." "So we have a paradox." Dr. Heller's methodical mind ticked off the possibilities systematically. "Either the early exam was wrong, in which case he was paranoid all the time, or the exam was right, and he turned paranoid later, neither of which things are supposed to happen. Or," Wolfe presented the third possibility, "he is withholding information while in deep therapy, also something that is not supposed to happen. So this leads us to the second point that bothers me. Britton talks about sitting up all night trying to figure out what his experiment was leading to. Yet he never mentioned what conclusion he came to. Apparently this is a crucial point which is buried in his mind so deeply that we didn't touch it with our first try." "Could be?" Alma Heller seemed sceptical. "There are a lot of very iffy questions running around in my head which could be settled simply if we could get some concrete information. Do you think you could buzz the AEC and ask them why Britton's project became classified? That would settle a number of obscure points and at the same time give us a handle with which to pry Jim open a little more." Wolfe shrugged. "We might get our heads chopped off, but we can try. My contact at the AEC is Charles Wilford. He's the one who was so anxious to know what Britton did the night of the 15th. Maybe he can trade us some information." Wolfe pushed the button for an outside line and asked for the Atomic Energy Commission, extension 5972. Wilford's image appeared on the phone screen, the picture of a large, powerful face with a great mass of grey hair. Wolfe knew him only as someone high up in the personnel department of the AEC. "Good morning, Dr. Wolfe," he said. "Find anything out?" Wolfe shrugged. "Britton killed Glover, if that's what you want to know. But why? That's what really interests us. You can tell us one thing that will help us find out, and that is, did Glover really take Britton off his project for security reasons? If so, what were those reasons?" Wilford's face froze slightly. "Obviously, Dr. Wolfe, if security were involved, it is a matter I cannot discuss with you, especially over the phone. You may write me a full confidential report, and we will consider what is to be done." Wolf cut the connection in exasperation and pushed his chair away from the desk. "Well, there's a bureaucratic mind for you," he exclaimed. "He wants a problem solved and then refuses to give you the information necessary to solve the problem." Slowly he filled his thinking pipe and lit it. "The hell with them," he said finally. "We'll see this thing through ourselves. We'll have another session with Britain tomorrow and get to the bottom of the story." "I hope," Alma Heller added, "that there is a bottom to be found." As the attendants strapped Jim Britton on the table the next morning, Dr. Wolfe thought how often the formula for murder repeated itself in this psychiatric age. Knock off the victim, prepare a real sick motive, and be sure you'll go to a hospital for treatment, to be released after a cure. Under these circumstances, the psychiatrist must become a detective, required to dig deep for the real motive, which generally resolved itself into the classical ones to love, hate, money. From his point of view as a doctor, any murder was a sick act, but the authorities were interested only in the legal question of whether the murderer knew what he was doing, and why. In this case, the question of the motive had a fascination to Wolfe, even from a purely academic point of view. "Let's face it," he told Britton. "We both know you killed Glover. You've heard the playback of yesterday's session, so you can no longer fall back on the old excuse of, 'Everything went black, and when I came to, he was dead.' Nobody gets away with that any more." Britton maintained a sullen silence. "Just for the record," Wolfe continued, "I want to fill in an important gap in the story. You told us that you sat up half the night figuring out what discovery your experiment was aiming at, but you glossed over what you actually decided at that time. Suppose we return to that night and go over the story once more in a little more detail." Britton continued his silence, and beyond a single hostile glare from beneath half-lidded eyes, gave no expression of emotion. Wolfe, as he checked the connections and slipped Britton the hypodermic, was thankful that his technique did not depend upon a friendly rapport between doctor and patient. Presently Britton began to talk. "You're being taken off the project because it's become classified secret," Glover had said, and at a blow an entire year of work had been struck out from beneath Jim Britton's feet. As he sat in his room, he picked raucous chords on his guitar and allowed the anger to wash deliciously through his consciousness. Not for a minute did he believe the security classification story. He knew that the project was beginning to strike gold in an unexpected direction, and he knew what that direction was. There was a discovery in the making, a discovery so precious that for every diamond-like star out there beyond the porthole there could be a bucket of diamonds accruing to the discoverer. And Glover was after the prophet himself, pushing Britton out of the way. This was the thought that clawed little furrows in his mind. Then, pushing their way into those little furrows came other thoughts, such as, suppose Glover should have an accident. I'd have his notebooks, and... Then he began thinking of returning to Earth, and the vision of spending a life dedicated to research in a laboratory became clouded over. Instead, there arose a picture of himself riding in an expensive car with beautiful, expensive women. He ripped a full chord out of his guitar and began to sing. In the morning, Glover stopped at Britton's breakfast table, annoyed with word of the iron source burnout. "Now how are we going to get it fixed?" he demanded in exasperation. "Gamp cut his hand yesterday. Williams had his appendix out a week ago. Langsdorff is busy with a kick sorter and—" "Why don't we do it ourselves?" Britton interrupted, eagerly. "It'll do us good to get into spacesuits again." It would do Jim Britton some good, he thought to himself. If genius was measured by the ability to spot an opportunity, then his success was assured. The plan of action was in his mind, completely formed in that instant. On the outer skin of the satellite, the two of them alone. Any one of a number of accidents could occur. Holding them down against the pull of centrifugal force would be only the magnetic shoes and a thin line. From that beginning, his mind went precisely to its conclusion. "Alma," Morris Wolfe said, "I'm beginning to feel very uneasy. What do we have here?" He poured coffee into the cups on his desk. Alma Heller looked at him shrewdly and stirred sugar into her cup. "I think we have a bear by the tail," she said. "We seem to peel off layers of Jim Britton's mind, and each time there's something different underneath. Every time he tells his story there is something new and contradictory in it, and there is no clue as to whether he is getting nearer or farther from the truth." Wolfe swiveled his chair around and stared out the window onto the hospital lawn. "We thought that the deep therapy method was something perfect, something that we could make a patient tell the absolute truth as he saw it. But our patient is making hash out of it." He lifted his coffee cup and tasted the black liquid tentatively. "Follow it through. The first story he gave us was conscious. He said he couldn't remember exactly what happened to him. Okay, this could be a fabrication. The next story he gave under therapy conditions. He said that he killed Glover in a fit of rage because of an argument. Okay again. We could have accepted that at face value, and he would have gotten away with it, except that we got curious about a couple of things. We wondered how the paranoid tinge got into his thoughts, and we wondered exactly what it was that he and Glover were on the verge of discovering. So we tried again. Now we find that he deliberately plotted to kill Glover, and the paranoid symptoms are now so intense that he gives us a completely phony story about making millions of dollars out of the discovery, when everybody knows you can't patent anything for personal profit when you invent it in a government laboratory." Alma Heller lifted a hand, making a one with a forefinger. "So, our friend Jim Britton is doing two things, both of which we did not believe him capable of doing. First, he is lying and inventing stories under deep therapy. Second, he is withholding information. For notice that he is still avoiding specific mention of the result which his experiment was aiming at." Her voice became flat, precise, and probing. "Now, could our young physicist Jim Britton do this thing? No. Not unless he is an unsuspected Superman type. Or unless he has had special training and conditioning for resistance against deep therapy. How does a young physics student obtain such training, and where?" She looked across the desk at Morris Wolfe, who chewed savagely on his pipe bit. "If I had any sense," he growled, "I'd call up the AUC and throw Jim Britton right back in their faces. If they give me a problem to solve, they should at least tell me how hot they think it is, and my viscera are beginning to tell me that this is going to be a very, very warm baby. Maybe I should holler for help. I have a wife and 2 kids at home. I don't want to get hurt." "Who are you kidding?" Alma wanted to know. "You wouldn't let a juicy problem like this escape you just when you have it clutched about the middle. Besides, our 2 undercover friends from the FBI will be keeping their eyes on things. Let them earn their pay." "Okay," Wolfe came to a decision. "We'll give it one more try, and then we'll call for help. First thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, there are 2 things I want. First, I want Britton to have a complete physical examination. The works, inside and outside. Blood tests, electroencephalograph, tissue specimens, complete x-rays, everything they can think of. Then I'll spend tonight keeping company with Britton while the technicians pull down some overtime pay analyzing the examination results." "You have an idea?" He nodded. "At least one idea, but it needs feeding." That evening, Morris Wolfe walked down the hospital corridor past the door of Britton's room. He entered the next door and found himself in a tiny chamber already occupied by Bill Grady. This was no surprise, for he knew that Grady and Jones kept Britain under constant surveillance. He motioned for Grady to keep his seat and made himself comfortable in another chair, which he placed so that he could watch Britain through the one-way window set in the wall. Through this window he could see every move which Britain made, and through a loudspeaker he could hear every sound. It was not clear in Wolf's mind precisely what he expected to find by watching Britain, but he knew that if he was to unravel his puzzle, he must know everything about the boy, including the way he walked and talked and combed his hair. For a time Britain sat and read, then paced the floor restlessly, as if waiting for something. Finally he picked his guitar up from the bed and sat down on his chair, tuning the instrument. When he began to sing, it was quietly, as though to himself. Wolf had heard him sing before, generally folk songs from the southern and midwestern states. Now there intruded into Wolf's mind a thought which had previously been on the edge of consciousness, and simultaneously his hand reached out to touch the start button on his tape recorder. The manner in which a person sings should reveal a great deal about his early life, about the kind of language he grew up with, down to the very vocal structure which has developed in his body since childhood. As a result, there are many types of voices: French voices, Tennessee voices, Italian voices, Texas voices, each with its own flavor caused by the way in which the vocal muscles have been trained by the native language, and also by the way in which people are accustomed to singing in those places. When Wolf went home that night, he carried a tape of Britain's song with him. It was convenient that he did not have to go far for an expert opinion to corroborate what he had already decided as an amateur. He entered his house, the pleasant place with the warm colours, the rows of books, the grand piano, and, of course, his wife. "Sorry I had to stay late, dear, but there's something important going on, something really important, and you can be a big help to me right now." "Me?" asked Lynn. "You're going back to musical therapy?" "Not exactly," he said dryly. "More like musical detection. I'm going to play a tape recording of a song or two, and I want your professional opinion as to what part of the world the singer came from." He walked over to the recorder and began threading the tape. "Now pay no attention to the song itself," he instructed. "I'm interested only in the voice quality." The tape spool unrolled slowly, and Britain's voice filled the room. "Not bad for an amateur," Lynn commented, listening closely. For several minutes he remained silent, until finally the tape was completed. "Well," she said finally, "I don't think it's an American. A bit too rich. It doesn't have the French quality, nor the Italian. More chesty, kind of ripe and fruity. Central European, Hungarian, Russian, or something of that order." Wolf kissed her solemnly. "You win first prize, girl. That's the answer I wanted, and that's the answer that fits." Chapter 3. In the morning, the act of going to the hospital produced within him a sensation as of marching to the front line of battle. Whitehead, the laboratory chief, was prowling about his office when he arrived. "Morning," Wolf greeted him. "Got something for me?" "I have a strangeness," Whitehead said. "A very great strangeness." "We all do," Wolf replied. "What's yours?" "This Briton of yours. How old is he?" "By appearance, and according to the records, about 21. "Uh-huh. And by cellular structure and metabolism he is at least 40. "So?" Wolf sank down in his chair and cocked an eye at Alma Heller, who came into the room at that moment. "Did you hear that, Alma? In more ways than one, our boy isn't what he seems to be. By last night,
I was certain that he is not a native of Louisville, Kentucky. Now we are told that he is twice as old as we thought he was." Alma stared for a moment.
"We do seem to get in deeper and deeper. Have any ideas?"
Wolf ran his hand worriedly through his hair. "One, but I'm afraid of it. At any rate, we're in too far to back out. This morning we're going to dig for more information, and we're not going to stop until we have Britain squeezed dry." He reached into his desk for his tobacco can and began filling a pipe, meanwhile organizing his thoughts. "Somehow or other," he resumed, "Britain has received conditioning to resist giving information under deep therapy."
"And not only that," Alma interposed, "but he has the ability to retain consciousness under deep therapy and fabricate a story to replace the true facts."
"Correct. So since the ordinary deep therapy method is useless, we have to get tough. We have to eliminate his present set of conditioned reactions and replace them by a new set. In other words, we must reset the controls so that he responds to a new set of orders."
Alma pursed her lips for a soundless whistle. "Fisher's method. Do you know how much of that a nervous system can take?"
Wolf shrugged. "Who knows? This is very new stuff. I've played around with a little of it, but who knows? At any rate, we're going to assume that Britain has a fairly tough mind in order to get as far as he has. We'll assume that not only for his own sake, but for ours, because we are going to shake him loose from his present set of memories, and we want enough of his original memories left for us to assemble. Now suppose we begin." Whitehead excused himself. There was work waiting in his laboratory, he said, and watched wistfully as the two disappeared into the therapy room. Alma began switching on the apparatus, while Wolf called for Jim Britton to be brought in.
"Still going digging in my mind," Britton wisecracked as he walked in, flanked by the ubiquitous Grady and Jones.
"With a steam shovel," Wolf replied, and motioned that Britton be strapped onto the table. This time Wolf wasted no explanations. Without pausing, he slipped Britton a preliminary shot and began fitting electrodes onto his head and arms. "We're going back a long time now," he said quietly. "Remember back to the days before you started college. How old are you?"
Britton began dreaming off. 16 years old. It was a hot summer, Kentuckian summer. Hot. Hot as a solar cycle. Hot as a bicycle down the road. A tricycle down the road. Doctor, you look like a big, pimply, warty, green-eyed toad.
Morris Wolfe waited until the drug-induced schizophrenic symptoms were well underway, then motioned for Alma Heller to send a sequence of high-frequency pulses through Britton's nervous system, breaking down synapses and destroying memory patterns. This, in combination with the drug, was intended to clear the mind of memories involving the period of time to which Britton's attention had been directed. In this period, Wolfe guessed, the conditioning had taken place. If not, then he must try another period. Britton's body stiffened under the onslaught, and perspiration rolled out on his brow. His mouth twisted, and his eyebrows writhed. Morris Wolfe himself felt perspiration starting out on his face, while in the back of the room the two attendants stared in amazement. After enough time of this, Wolfe switched the controls so that a rhythmic pattern of pulses went through Britton's system in such a manner as to aid the triggering of synapses and the formation of memory patterns. The slate having been wiped clean, new writing had to be placed on it. "Now," he said tensely, leaning over the patient and speaking close to his ears, "cooperation means obey. Cooperation means obey. Cooperation means you do what I say. Cooperation means you do what I tell you to do, say what I tell you to say, remember what I tell you to remember. Cooperation is the key word." The words went from Wolfe's mouth to Britton's ears in the form of sound waves, were converted into neural electrical impulses, and under the influence of the rhythmically repeating pulses from the machine, circulated around and around through Britain's system, tracing a deeply etched path. Finally Wolf ceased the talking, and Ulmer handed him the needle with the antidote to the first drug. "Now we see how successful we are," he said. He gave the shot, and several minutes went by while they waited for it to take effect. They remained silent, as though to say a word would break the spell. Then, "Cooperation," Wolf said. Britain lay still. "Open your eyes." Britain's eyelids struggled open, but the eyes stared blankly. Wolf thought, what question is most basic? Then he asked, "What is your name?" The mouth writhed, and then whispered, "Pyotr Ferdmineyev." There was a small roaring in Maurice Wolf's ears, and beside him he heard the intake of Ulmer Heller's breath. The FBI agents Grady and Jones had moved up until they were leaning over Wolf's shoulder. Then, "Where were you born?" Again the whisper from the blank face. "In Leningrad." Then, "Who sent you to America?" "The Society for the Restoration of the Revolution." "What is the nature of this organization?" "It is an underground group pledged to return the Soviet Union to its status as a leader of the world revolution and to overthrow the present appeasers of the capitalist governments." Wolf glowed with triumph. "Get that, Ulmer," he gloated, and he turned around halfway and winked at the two men behind him. Ulmer Heller shook a strand of hair back from her eyes. "The fanatical revolutionaries. Now they're trying to overthrow their own government because the Soviet is too friendly to the Western governments." "This is no comic underground group," Wolf said. "There are some big people in it who know how to do things that we're just barely starting to learn about." He paused and considered his next questions. The time had come to dig in. He phrased his query. "What was your task on the satellite?" Britain's face writhed. Perspiration rolled down his cheeks in a steady stream. Obviously some of the original conditioning remained, causing interference with Wolf's orders. Ulmer Heller's knuckles showed white, and her clenched hands trembled. The FBI agents inched forward, their bodies stiff with impatience. Between hard breaths, the words came. "Was on the satellite to watch. New developments in nuclear power. Complete conversion. Matter to energy." Understanding grew in Wolf's mind with a brilliant glare. Glover had been on the verge of taming the ultimate source of energy, the total and complete conversion of matter, a source of power over 130 times more potent than the hydrogen-helium reaction. No wonder the project had been put under wraps. "So you killed Glover to prevent him from continuing his work. What did you intend to gain by that? Somebody else will take it over. How are you going to develop this power source yourself?" Britain groaned audibly. His back arched and his arms strained against the table straps. Through clenched teeth, "Rupert! Next man in line for Glover's job. One of us." Wolf's eyes opened wide, and he whirled to the telephone. "I'm calling Washington," he began, then stopped in horror. Behind him, Britain's voice said, in a strangely firm tone, "Now is the time." Wolf whirled again. He saw Britain, still strapped to the table, his eyes unglazed and his facial expression commanding. The FBI men had stiffened and were standing in place, motionless.
"Cover them and untie me," Britain rapped out, in a voice that was greatly different from the youthful, uncertain tone he had previously used. Grady pulled his gun, backed Wolf and Alma Heller against the wall, while Jones loosened Britain's straps. "So you're one of them too, Grady," Wolf growled. "And you, Jones, may you burn in hell." "Don't malign them," said Britain, sitting up and rubbing his arms. "They are good, loyal G-men, but they sat outside my door too long, and now they do what I tell them to do." Wolf narrowed his eyes and stared at Britain. "Just what are you?" he demanded. Britain met his gaze bleakly and ignored the question. "We had a rendezvous to make. The two of you will escort me to a helicopter that Grady will order. I need not repeat that we are prepared to blast our way out of this place. You'll save lives all around by being as inconspicuous as possible." He indicated that Wolf and Alma Heller should go ahead, while the two agents took up the rear. Out in the main corridor, they merged into the confused traffic of the busy hospital, 2 doctors and 2 attendants conducting a patient out. Grady took the controls of the helicopter that waited for them out in the parking lot. As they climbed to a high-traffic lane, Jones took care of tying the hands of the 2 doctors behind their seats. Britain sat beside the pilot, staring through the windshield. "Head due west 100 miles, he said. "Then I'll give you further directions." Wolf looked down through the port next to him and felt his heart constrict as he saw the houses below grow smaller and smaller. One of those houses was his. There was a small figure beside it that could have been his little boy. That was the thought that set his heart beating violently and the adrenaline pumping swiftly through his veins. For himself, he didn't care so much, but his son needed a father to come home. He looked at Alma sitting beside him, her face pale and frightened. He wondered how much time there was before the rendezvous, for this was all the time he had. Beyond that, there were too many unknown factors to consider. He leaned over, sideways. "Alma," he said in a voice not loud enough to carry forward over the roar of the motor. "Tell me exactly what happened when Britain said, 'Now is the time.' My back was turned then. Just what did he look like?" Alma swallowed. She composed her face and turned her thoughts inward, remembering. "There was a sudden change," she said. "One moment he was in a trance state. The next moment he was fully aware of his surroundings and in charge of the situation, as though he received a signal at that instant." A signal, Wolf thought. From where? The implication was shocking. "Look at what we have," he continued to himself. "Britain comes to me, under conditioning, ready to act out his part to the hilt. We question him under deep hypnotherapy, and he comes forth with a plausible story. We might have stopped right there, but we got curious and began to ask more questions. He brings out another story. Why? Obviously red herrings to confuse the issue, to stall for time. We apply more pressure, blank out his original conditioning so he gives us straight answers to questions, and we are getting along fine. Then suddenly he snaps out of it and into his original pre-Britain character, all 40 years of him. Therefore, there must have been another, deeper level to the control over his mind which we did not even touch. A level activated by a new signal which we did not even detect, a signal which came at a crucial time. Now is the time meant that the stalling was over, that the preparations for Britain's escape were completed. There were still questions to be answered, many blank spaces to be filled in, but at the present instant there was only one question that mattered. The treatment which Wolf had given Britain, had it been at all effective? Was it still effective? There was one way to find out. Morris Wolf leaned forward and called in a loud voice, "Pyotr Feminyev!" The man's head snapped around. "Cooperation is the key word," Wolf shouted. Confusion passed over Britton's face as conflict once more knotted his nervous system. Wolf threw his second punch immediately. "Tell Jones to cut me loose," he demanded. "Cut him loose," Britton echoed in bewilderment. After an interminable interval, Jones laid down his gun, found his knife, opened it, and slashed the cords from Wolf's arms. Wolf's muscles were already tensed. He snatched Jones's gun, lurched forward, and even as Britton's mouth opened to countermount his order, he slugged Britton with the butt of the pistol, hitting him viciously and hard until he lay unconscious on the floor. Then he said to Grady, "You'd better get us back to the hospital," keeping the gun in his hand. But Grady and Jones made no trouble. With Britton out of the picture, they obeyed the one obviously in command. Poor boys, Wolf thought. Now they were in need of therapy. As the hospital hove into view, he said to All Mahela, "We have just seen the real beginning of psychological warfare, where it took us in a whole room full of equipment to condition Britton's responses to a trigger word. He was able to do it to Jones and Brady single-handed. His method is something we'd like to know. But more than that, Britton himself was conditioned to respond to a signal unknown to us and undetected by us. My God, it could only have been telepathic." All Mahela's eyes closed for a moment. "I think," she said, "that psychiatrists are going to reach the same position that physicists did during World War II. Morris Wolfe looked dourly out of the window, watching the hospital balloon up under the helicopter. "That's the most unpleasant thing anybody has said all day," he replied. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. From the pages of dusty old pulp magazines to your ear.